All right, looks like we are live, and I want to thank everybody for their patience. We promise you the wait is going to be worth it. So we are here. I'm here with Matt Man, and we've got an exciting program for everybody tonight. We are going to be debunking a video that came out on Sentinel Apologetics channel. It's a video that has to do with a lecture from Joel Duff. Okay. And I don't know about you, Matt, but when I see new videos supposedly debunking young Earth creation or attempting to support universal common ancestry, I get excited because I think maybe there's going to be some new arguments, something novel that we can tackle. But typically, I think I can speak for you as well. We are disappointed because these are the same typical talking points that are being thrown around. The critics like to say that the young Earth creation model of ancestry says that we need what's called hyper-evolution in order to explain the thousands of species today. So is this true? Is this really the case? Well, this is what we're going to find out tonight. And we're going to go through the video word by word, sentence by sentence for you guys. We've already got a great chat. So I want to acknowledge some of the supporters. Christian Northman, I appreciate the super sticker. And Jamie Russell, thank you as well. My good man, George Bond putting our kids through college. I appreciate the super sticker. God bless you, brother. So Godzilla Freak says, I remember Jeanson's article / presentation on Joel Duff. It was brutal. Yes, it was brutal. This is yet again just more evidence as to how out of date and out of touch with reality the critics are. So please check the description box of this video for a number of articles and technical papers that directly refute and address the information coming out of this Joel Duff video. Okay, the critics are definitely out of date. So Steadfast and Easy says, gentlemen, good evening. Currently tangling with one that dances well around all of the problems. Thank you, brother, for the support. We appreciate it. So that being said, before we get into it, a couple reminders. This week, we've got the big Age of the Earth debate between Dr. Kenny Rhodes and Dr. Kent Hovind. That is this Thursday. The debate is going to kick off at 8 o'clock EST, 7 o'clock Central. So make sure you are here for that. The very next week, we're going to have another Age of the Earth debate. Kent Hovind will be back with us debating Smoky Saint. So that's going to be a lot of fun as well. But this Wednesday, we've got Dr. Frank Turek here for a discussion on I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So please be there live because we are going to be having a live audience Q&A for that. So definitely check that out. And Ramat and I are ecstatic to see the reception to our epic destruction of science denier Aaron Ra. That video definitely shared around. It's packed with information and rebuttals to the most common arguments and repeated talking points coming out of the evolutionist side. So that being said, Matt, why don't you introduce yourself and introduce the topic? I know you're just as excited as I am for tonight, dealing with these claims pertaining to speciation and the universal ancestry model versus the separate ancestry model, brother. How you doing tonight? And why don't you introduce the topic for us?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks. I'm glad everybody is here. I look up and I see comments 72 missed. That's pretty quick. I mean, I haven't been in here that long. So I think everybody's going to really like this video because it just covers a wide variety of topics. The guy's coming right out saying, you know, scripture says one thing, but it means another. Evolution is true because it has to be, and scripture's wrong in these areas. And there's no evidence of genetic boundaries. There's no evidence for young Earth creation. You guys believe in evolution. and you guys believe in more of an evolutionary stance than we do because you believe in hyper-evolution. He also says that we can't trust scripture. He's all over the place. So I think you guys are really going to like this, because we're going to play the video word for word like we usually do. But this one's half an hour, so you're going to have to bear with us. We're going to speed it up, but we're not going to miss any of his arguments. I've never really taken notes for any of these things, and I've done that for this video. So that's all I've done the last 2 days. This is going to be annihilation. I'm going to take everything that he says apart. I don't care. So, in matter of fact, while we do that, if you even throw in some super chats so that he sees them and their questions and comments, that go ahead, throw them in. I don't care.
Yes.
This is already taken care of. I mean, I have literally 150 photos that I want to share. I couldn't even upload them. Crazy.
Yeah, as usual, we like to be as interactive as possible with the chat, guys. So if you have any questions, objections, please let us know, and we'll do our best to address them. If you haven't checked, I guess it was a couple weeks ago now, hey Matt, we did a video similar to this. It was a 3-hour video debunking Deep Platform Dan. Okay, pseudoscience man Dan Sterncardi now on the genetic boundary study. So we went into great detail on that, and definitely check that out, because that again supports our model of ancestry, which we'll be getting into here. But that video refutes all the best so-called arguments against the genetic boundary study and how it relates to our model. So before we get into this, Jerome says, thanks for all the info you loaded in the descriptions, brother. Going to keep me busy for a while. Yes. Tons of articles and technical papers that clearly the critics have not looked into, or else they wouldn't repeat arguments that have already been addressed and debunked. So before we get into this, Matt, and before I start the video that we're going to be playing, the first thing that comes to mind, okay, when I hear this hyper evolution argument, okay, that young Earth creationists believe in more evolution than the evolutionists. This has come up numerous times in debates as well. And I've linked in the description box my being Standing for Truth 2021 debates, where I've debated numerous times on this topic of ancestry. And typically this comes up. Okay, right off the bat, what that argument tells me is that the person putting forth it doesn't understand evolution, and also doesn't understand young Earth creation or separate ancestry, okay? Because the evolutionary model and the young Earth creation model, okay, the biblical creation model of ancestry, have two very different explanations for the origin of genetic diversity, which most critics fail to understand, because they're arguing in a circular manner, because they're starting from evolution, assume evolution to prove evolution, right? Well, the evolutionists explain the vast majority, if not all, DNA differences and genetic diversity as a result of mutations over time. The creationists, as everybody who follows this channel probably knows by now, looks to what's called created nuclear heterozygosity, okay? And we've demonstrated over and over again that just by invoking simple heterozygosity, incredible variation can be created, even in a single generation, okay? So this starting point has very, very different expectations than the evolutionary starting point, where they have to build up the DNA differences over time in order for genetic processes like gene conversion and recombination to be able to act upon these differences. But if these differences are designed from the beginning, then even in one single generation, Matt, as you know, we can produce visible variety. Okay, so this design diversity hypothesis would suggest that we've got organisms that were designed with internal genetic diversity. And this makes sense of the data and leads to testable predictions, which we're going to get into later. Okay. So you don't have to explain scientifically all genetic diversity as the result of mutations over time. Okay. And I've pointed this out in the past, but two individuals, let's say my wife and myself, or Matt and his wife, okay, we have 4 chromosome sets. We then with that built-in genetic information, have the ability that allows for vast amounts of genetic diversity and change, which natural selection, which nobody denies, the evolutionists and the creationists, can use and utilize for adaptive purposes. We don't need evolutionary deep time and diversity originating mechanisms, okay? So right off the bat, that's what it tells me is the evolutionists, the critics, they're arguing from a straw man that assumes all DNA diversity is the result of mutations over time. So that being said, I wanted to give some context before we get into the video so people can recognize while they're watching Joel Duff's presentation that no, young Earth creationists are not hyper evolutionists, okay? Because we have a totally different starting point, which leads to testable predictions on DNA function, okay, molecular clock related testable predictions, rates of speciation, for example. We're going to get into all of that, guys. I just wanted to kind of set the foundation here, okay? Matt, any points you wanted to add, brother, before we start this video?
No, because at about the 2 minutes and 35-second mark, he actually mentions that we believe in hyperevolution. So rather than just touch on it again, I think I'll save my comment for that time stamp.
Okay. So this just came to mind. I want to say this one last thing before we go. I know we're going to say a lot of stuff, but Dr. Robert Carter has put it this way in one of his technical articles on new information, okay? The fact is, your pond scum to people or your fish to fisherman evolution has to explain what? Has to explain how the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes and chock full of meta information came about, okay? That is a major problem for the evolutionists. But from the created heterozygosity starting point, we start with organisms with design variation. And that's why we see the epigenome. That's why we see these rapid changes due to epigenetic regulation, which even the evolutionists are shocked at these organisms that go into a new environment and through epigenetic regulation, a gene is turned on and we have rapid adaptation because of these built-in mechanisms, which goes back to the design to diversity hypothesis. So that being said, two totally different starting points. And anytime you hear the evolutionists or the critics say that the young Earth creationist believes in hyperevolution, you automatically should recognize that they are knocking down a straw man as they don't understand clearly the evolution model or the young Earth creation model. So that being said, Matt, let me share screen, brother. And you let me know when you'd like me to pause. And to the audience, let us know if the video is playing well in terms of the audio. So here we go.
Good morning. Greg and I are pleased that you've chosen to spend some time with us talking about this very important topic. Put in its broadest context, we might ask, what is the origin of the awe-inspiring biological diversity that we witness every day around us? The answer to this question has increasingly divided.
Matt, maybe I'll mute you while it's playing, just so there's no I'll mute myself too, and then just make sure you unmute yourself, brother, when you want me to pause.
Sure. All right.
For a few
I probably pause them around like 35 seconds or something.
Okay.
It's already that ridiculous that soon. So.
Right. Okay, brother.
Christians. The typical lay Christian has been conditioned to think in bimodal terms on this topic, as if one side were upholding orthodox conservative Christianity, and the other were just simply swayed by liberal tendencies. Our intention is not to provide a solution today, as if that were possible, but rather shed light on the inadequacy of this bimodal simplistic viewpoint and promote tools and questions for further engaging and having productive dialogue. To do so, we're just taking off a small bite of this.
All right.
We wish to bring to your attention the evolution of the young Earth model.
He already said that. He says we're trying to say that they are pushing liberal tendencies. I just wanted to say no. You just clearly deny that the Bible says that Adam was a real person that lived in a real garden, that lived in a real place, that lived to a real old age, that lived in a real time, and that Jesus himself died for this human. So if he's not a real person, Jesus died for nothing. If the guy wasn't real and didn't exist, then there was no sin that he committed. Therefore, Jesus died for nothing whatsoever. So it has to be true. It has to be a literal story, or else the entire rest of the Bible isn't true. It doesn't make any sense without the foundation. It's the root. So we're not saying that you guys have this liberal outlook on scripture because you don't take it literally. It's kind of like, well, you're supposed to be able to test and tell whether or not the rest of the Bible is to be taken true. You can't say that this part is true, but this one isn't. That's an allegory and this one's true. When if that one is an allegory, then this one can't be true. So you can't just pick and choose. You have to say, well, which one is this? And you have to remember that Standing for Truth debates constantly, and the critics who literally hate him admit outright that the most basic understanding of scripture is the young Earth creationist view, that it is a literal interpretation of what we're reading. And these are the critics, the ones that don't even like us and that don't like our model or our predictions. David Neff directly said that to you. Remember that? He said, I think that the most plain reading of scripture is what you guys believe. So, okay, let's say there is a more convoluted way to look at scripture. That's fine. Let's agree to disagree, but let's actually put it to the test. What does your model say? What does our model say? What does the evidence say? They don't even have a clear model from what I can tell. Matter of fact, we're going to get into that in just a minute, but they have no consensus on even what they agree on. They don't believe that 24-hour days weren't 24-hour days. They deny the plain reading of scripture on that one. And they deny that, oh, maybe sin wasn't really a true thing. And they build an entire upside down theology on that. Well, that gets hard to say that that's going to be a good model, because let's say you're an old Earth creationist and you talk to 5 other ones and they all have a different model. And then you come over to the young Earth creation side and there's maybe 1 or 2. It's much easier to understand and grasp where we're coming from because we have such a strong model. And it's very perplexing that these people tell us ours is wrong, but they don't even have one themselves. I mean, unless they just go with the evolutionary view entirely. So it's very perplexing from that standpoint as well. And I mean, we can keep going for just a minute. Yeah, just keep playing, I guess. Or you feel free to say something as well.
Yeah, I'll say this. See, here's the thing. And we've both written numerous books on this. Okay, I've got a couple books behind me. One of them, the Independent Origins Handbook. Okay, and in the introductory chapter, I go over the plain reading of Genesis that suggests man was specially created. Okay, specially created, separate from all other forms of life. Now you'll have these interpretations that we call biblical compromising interpretations that try and force fit universal common ancestry into the Bible where it does not belong. Okay, so this is what I say, and I just debated Bill Tavis, a militant theistic evolutionist, a couple months ago, and we debated the topic: is all life related through common ancestry? So let's see whose interpretation of the Bible, okay, best fits the empirical scientific data. Okay, because they want to force fit unnecessarily universal common ancestry into the Bible. Let's see if your forced interpretation is consistent with the data. And that's when we get into scientific arguments pertaining to what? Molecular clocks, DNA function, okay, the Y chromosome data that suggests that the chimpanzee Y chromosome and the human Y chromosome is less than 35% dissimilar. We've got the waiting time problem that suggests there are a huge number of DNA differences that need to be fixated. Fixated means to be stuck in place within that 6 million years since the split of chimpanzees and humans, okay? We've got the mitochondrial DNA data that suggests there are only a few DNA differences in the mitochondrial DNA compartment that separate any 2 people. We've got low genetic diversity, which is exactly what we'd expect from the biblical creation starting point. And we can go on and on and on. The genetic boundaries study, okay, all of these things that we've touched on that show you don't need to force fit universal common ancestry into the Bible, since universal common ancestry is not even supported by the empirical scientific data. The empirical scientific data supports the separate ancestry model, which is the plain reading of scripture, right? So Bill Tavis and I debated that for 3 hours. He had no arguments to mutation accumulation, no arguments to the molecular clock data, no arguments to the predictions coming out of the biblical model of ancestry. So that's the point I'm trying to make is we can take your interpretation, we can take our interpretation, and let's see which interpretation is most consistent with the scientific data. And you'll find these theistic evolutionists, especially, they are not up to date on the data, and they have no rebuttal to the data that suggests independent origins. So that being said, brother, did you want me to continue the video?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Well,
okay.
First of all, he wants us to believe that Moses was wrong when he wrote Genesis, and that every translator from that time till now was also wrong. That requires more faith for their desperate compromising position than young Earth creationists would ever have to do. They're the new breed of indoctrinated, biased Christians, I believe, that are compromising to fit their evolutionary beliefs of modern day science into the scriptural belief because they don't have another way around it. To me, it's a lot like the Pope. What does he know about evolution? Matter of fact, I bet you anything, he's never even heard the word mutation rate, ever. But yet he tells the masses that evolution is true. And because his word is God's voice, the following underneath him, the Catholics, they have to believe it's true. It's like God saying it. But they're believing somebody that literally has no understanding of the science of today. He just knows that's what the masses believe, therefore it must be true. So it's that cognitive dissonance where he goes, well, let's go that way, because if that's what the masses believe and we want the masses to follow us, we better believe it too. Here on this channel, we don't care. We just say it like it is. I don't want to be a minority where I'm hated by the vast majority of people on Earth because I'm a young Earth creationist. Then they immediately throw me in a box of a weird, like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist and all this. So you get more flack for believing in what we believe. So it's not like we had a choice. We just looked at the evidence and said, well, I can't believe this anymore. And you got to remember, this guy literally believes that the sun was already existing on day one. If you don't believe me, listen, watch right here. Ready? This is a debate Sentinel Apologetics had with Aaron Ra. Listen to him admitting right here that when Aaron Ra says this, what his response is to it.
You did mention things like, plants before sun and so on. I'm wondering, have you actually looked into the Hebrew scholarship that outside of science, Hebrew scholars have actually designated good arguments for the sun already existing in day one, and that the plants on day three, well, plants in this sense is very generic. So you're talking about vegetation on a new landmass that's appearing in the atmosphere, so that you have a regular cycle for the appearance of the sky on day 4. Okay. And then obviously the Cambrian comes on day 5.
So I could have gone on. I forgot how long I actually listened to it. But he essentially says, it's okay. Yes, the sun was created on day 4, but it was probably already there on day 1 because plants need the sun. What plants? What are you talking about? The plants aren't just sitting there. They're seeds. Seeds don't need the sun. Matter of fact, if you've ever grown anything from a seed, you put it in the closet in the darkest thing you can underneath the soil. The last thing it needs is sunlight. The darker, the better. So it definitely doesn't need the sun for one 24-hour day. Now, all of a sudden, you expand that 24-hour day into 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years. Now you have problems. Those seeds are going to rot. But just another example of how anything can be twisted. Anything can be wielded into their theory, just like evolution. So if something, Aaron Ross says, well, what about your problem with the sun? What does he do? He just goes, well, the sun could have already been there. I found a Hebrew scholar in the backyard of my house who was smoking crack, and he said that the sun could have been there. It says light was there. I don't know where they come up with this stuff. It can just wield any story that they want, and it doesn't matter if it says it in the Bible. You can find somewhere else where it might say something different that you can twist. It just reminds me a lot of inspiring philosophy. That's all. I will calm down now.
No, you're absolutely right. Great points. Great points. Like you said, it's just like the evolutionists where they don't question the bigger picture. But when we go to these lines of evidence that suggest separate ancestry as opposed to universal common ancestry, right? Or point out the fact that they have always predicted that the vast majority of DNA is the result of evolutionary leftovers, genomic fossils, right? The ancient remnants of past viral infections. And yet we say, hey, look, we've got the ENCODE project that says that over 80% of the genome is active. We've got data suggesting that Pseudogenes, which they say are shared genetic mistakes, are actually necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. We've got endogenous retroviruses, which are highly essential and functional in determining cell types, in immune response, cell stress response, in embryological development. How do you explain this, evolutionists? And they will resort to what? Co-option or storytelling, imagination, because they will always force fit the data into their story. Hey, evolutionists, you never predicted such low genetic diversity in humans. Every single human is 99.999% similar. How do you explain that if we've been evolving for millions and millions of years, from the Australopithecines up to Homo habilis, up to Homo erectus for a million years or so? And then eventually modern man, you'd have mutations accumulating, adding genetic diversity. So we should be highly divergent in terms of genetic diversity. And yet what? We have low genetic diversity, which points us back to Adam and Eve just a few thousand years ago. How do you explain that, evolutionists? And then they invent what? The post hoc, ad hoc, out of Africa population bottleneck, which is just a story to force fit the data into the evolutionary based assumptions. And that's what we're seeing here with the scripture as well. So that's a great point, brother. Did you want me to?
Yeah, let's keep going.
Continue? Okay. Because yeah, at this rate, we probably would be going all night. So here we go.
Of origins that we believe has resulted in some substantial changes to orthodox traditions that young Earth creationists have typically sought to defend. In a sense, we're trying to update you on what is the modern young Earth creationist model of origins. Aha. This presentation is broken down into 4 parts. First, we will describe the model being promoted by leading young Earth proponents today. This isn't necessarily the model that the average young Earth follower might fully recognize, but it is where the movement is currently headed. Secondly, we'll provide a very brief scientific assessment. And with that background on hand, we can explore the theological impacts of that model and the questions we think the church should be asking, how we can ask questions that are informed. So where do we begin? Well, the backdrop of the whole conversation begins in Genesis, right? Genesis 1 says, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. We'll focus on a single word here. That word I emphasize, that word is kind. It is a good entryway into having a conversation about origins and biological diversity, really with anyone of any persuasion. For most of church history, kind was understood to be akin to the animals that we're familiar with and produce other creatures of the same type. God has revealed to us that he's created everything and every creature. He further reveals to us that we can depend on these creatures, behaving according to his rules. So how does this kind figure into the new creationism that we're talking about here? The desire is to associate a kind with a discrete scientific taxonomic group. That desire only became acute for young Earth creationists with the realization that the world today contains a vast array of different types of organisms we call species. The 20th century young Earth community, intent on proving the scientific accuracy of the Genesis flood, came to the internal realization that all the Earth's existing and extinct species could not fit on Noah's Ark. Then if that's the case, then the definition of a biblical kind must be broader than a species, maybe considerably broader. In 1996, John Woodmarapp published a seminal book attempting to explain how the Ark could have fit all the animals. He estimated the Ark only needed to accommodate 8,000 kinds. This was quite radical even in 1996, right? But today, displays on the Ark Encounter in Kentucky list 1,387 kinds that were on the Ark, with a suggestion.
Oh, did you have some comments, brother? I thought I heard.
Oh no, I was muted. But yeah, we can jump right into it now if you want. I was just going to let it run a few more minutes and then go back to address all of it, but it's fine.
Okay, let's do one more minute just so we, I guess, have more of the video to comment on, because as we know, we've gone 3 hours on 10-minute videos. So what we'll do is we'll go one more minute, get to the 5-minute mark, and then we'll make our comments, brother. So here we go.
Okay.
If you read their literature a little deeper, that this might actually be an overestimate. Maybe many, many fewer were necessary to be there. So let's easily think about the increasing inclusiveness of this term and how it's changed in its meaning over time. When one realizes that even extinct kinds were present on the Ark, as we see here in this display at the Ark Encounter, the problem becomes rather daunting. Consider that conservatively, there have been at least 200,000 land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrate species, things that would have needed to have been preserved on the Ark. For Woodmarapp, if God created 8,000 kinds, then each created kind would have had to have diverged into an average of 50 species since its creation. For Ken Ham, this problem is even greater. His conservative estimate of kinds requires that each kind would have produced 142 species on average. In the new creationism, there's a whole lot of speciation going on. Let me illustrate the overall model. If I were to describe like what's the general model that young Earth creationists are now following. This figure provides an overview of the young Earth model, what I would call evolution. Kinds are separate creations. That's a difference. Made complete by the end of the sixth day of creation. But since that time, kinds have adapted, diversified, evolved, I guess pick your favorite term there, into the diverse species we see today. However, some animal kinds experience an extreme bottleneck, down to 2 individuals, followed by a re-expansion of diversity into all the species that we have today. AIG depicts some of these kinds and how they survived. Depicts some of the kinds that surviving the bottleneck only to go extinct. You can see that on this figure, that some individuals made it through the flood, but then immediately went to extinct. So in summary, animal kinds, and presumably all other kinds, can trace their origins to common ancestors that gave rise then to the diversity that we actually witness today. Today, the typical Christian—
That's good. There was a whole lot going on there. My personal favorite, even starting as early as 1 minute and 30 seconds in, is where he starts complaining, like RJ Downer did, that our model has changed with the science. What scientific model doesn't? Could you imagine complaining that the evolutionists are changing their model with the evidence? That would be every single day. So he's complaining about something that's so basic in science, it's unbelievable. He thinks we should be stagnant, but they can change. We can't, they can. It's just absolutely absurd. What did you think about that? Did you notice that?
Right. And I've got some quotes here based on his claims on how the young Earth creation model apparently changes or adapts in light of the scientific data. Well, like you said, what scientific model doesn't? But secondly, species as we know today is actually relatively new in terms of our understanding. So what I'm going to do is share screen here, okay? And right here. So from one of the articles that I have listed in the description box, does BioLogos strive for dialogue? Okay. The point is the young Earth creation speciation model, as Dr. Nathaniel Jensen points out, is a recent invention because species themselves are recent inventions. Okay. And as we know, we talk about Linnaeus, right? And his classification systematics, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. He based it off of function. And he based it off of a biblical creation starting point, okay? And that's what we look to as well when explaining these nested hierarchies. We look to hierarchies by design versus descent, okay? So here he points out that the species concept as we understand and use it, as Duff, that's the guy speaking, uses it, is a recent invention. Modern taxonomy did not begin until Carl Linnaeus published his Systema Naturae in the 1700s. Okay. Furthermore, Linnaeus' understanding of species was a far cry from what we understand today. For example, in 1758, only 154. Okay, notice this. Only 154 of the modern mammal species were recognized. In 1859, the year in which Charles Darwin first published On the Origin of Species, only 1,780 modern mammal species were documented. Today, over 5,400 living mammal species have been documented. And Jensen points out that this is being overly generous in his description, okay? Just because a scientist documents a new species somewhere doesn't mean that the scientific community as a whole is aware of it. The process of communicating new discoveries takes time. As an example, consider standard mammalian reference text as a surrogate for the general understanding of the scientific community. In 1993, one such text listed only 4,629 mammal species, even though 5,186 species were technically documented. Just 12 years later, the same text was updated to include over 780 additional mammal species, bringing the total to over 5,000, okay? So point is, we have obviously adapted the model the more that we've understood the species concept. And Matt, as you know, how many definitions of species exist, right? Because they'll accuse us creationists of not knowing what the definition of a kind is in every circumstance, right?
Right.
But they themselves can't agree on what a species is. I mean, there's dozens of definitions of what a species is, right, brother?
Yep, almost 30. Yep. If you add baraminology, you have 30 different definitions. That's why if you invariably use one and you're arguing against somebody, you can use another definition just to refute them. That's how many species concepts there are. It's unbelievable. And this guy hankers on about the word kind. He's really upset about it. The word kind, he complains that young Earth creationists used to view a kind by something we can identify today, like a house cat is a kind, but also so is a tiger and so is a cheetah. So today we would see these species, but of the same kind. So he's basically complaining that young Earth creationists nowadays can tell the public that Noah didn't bring several species of like a cat or a cheetah and a lion. He just needed one specific kind of cat. So he's actually more aggravated by the concept that we understand what a species is, because it's in one of their most popular definitions is something that can breed and bring forth, and then they changed it. Now it's something that can't breed with one another. So a cheetah and a lion are different species. A lion and a tiger are different species. But by their own definition of what a species is, they could all breed and bring forth. So are they really a different species? Because according to their own classification and their own definition of what a species is, it's not. They're not different species. So this is how we view it. This is a chart that I like to do. I show a horse, one of the original, one that was on the ark. They got off. They lost information over time. They went from more homozygous to heterozygous over deep time. The more they've encompassed the world, they basically maxed out the regions where they can diversify, and now they start going down. And we can see the same thing with an armadillo. Are they still armadillos? Yes, they are. Here's a beaver, gigantic, monstrous beaver before the flood. Here they are today, but yet still of the same kind. So according to them, we should have all these different species below here on the ark. That's what makes them mad, is we realize, no, these can bring forth and create more species that diversify, but they stay within their own kind. And that's what they get mad about. They go, well, you know, where's the dividing line? How can you know this? We're going to get into all that. I guarantee it. I just wanted to say that we know that this is more rapid now. We can see these things. We know from our observable evidence that this speciation rate is rapid in plants and in animals and reptiles and birds. You can basically take your pick and go down the list. It doesn't really matter where you look. It's all telling us the exact same thing. And if we can observe it today, I want you to imagine how much more you would be able to observe this in a world that was basically empty after the flood. It was wiped out. There's nothing but plants left. And then animals get off of the ark. And what do? Well, they migrate, they speciate, and fill the earth. You know, some went north. Elephants that did that became the mammoth. Some went south. They became a whole new species, because you don't need the hair. You get the hairless Indian elephant. So we have these great examples and visuals that we see for rapid speciation. And you have to remember, this was not predicted. Darwin predicted that one species of finch should arise once every 3,000 years. That was his prediction. That's what he put in writing. Guess what they found? One new finch species every 3.5 years. You talk about an utter failure of a prediction. You can't get much worse than that. That's literally in the entire realm of predictions. That's on the far spectrum of what they would have ever expected. And
let me point out, remember when you and I had that, we did two debates with Adam Heap. He's a zoologist and a herpetologist, right? And we debated him specifically on the evolutionary model of speciation versus the young Earth creation or separate ancestry model of speciation. And I highly recommend people watch those debates, because we get into the predictions from either the young Earth creation side or the evolution side. And although we put prediction after prediction, which some of these predictions coming true, which we're going to get into a little bit later when it comes to the young Earth creation model of speciation, he resorted to what? Well, we can't make predictions from the evolutionary model because there are too many extinction events, or there are too many variables that we would never be able to make a true prediction that is novel and testable. And we pointed out, well, then your explanation is pseudoscientific. The gold standard of science is to make future testable predictions that are falsifiable. And it's the creationists that are doing it in the realm of speciation rates. And it's fitting perfectly with the flood bottleneck of 4,500 years ago and all species coming from there. And a major, as I said earlier, I'm going to share screen again, okay, is this straw man argument that you see from the evolution, especially the old Earth creationists. It's hilarious, okay? You have like reasons to believe, for example, that try and say young Earth creationists believe in hyperevolution. But then when you press them and say, do you believe God would have created organisms, and let's say Adam and Eve, genetically homogeneous with no pre-existing DNA diversity? They'll say oftentimes that of course not. You know, when God said be fruitful and multiply, he didn't mean be fruitful and clone yourself. So even the old Earth creationists, like them at Reasons to Believe, will say, yeah, the created heterozygosity model that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve and the created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences makes sense. Well, then from that starting point, all you need in a single generation is recombination, shuffle up, scramble up those DNA variants, gene conversion, and you will have visible variety in one single generation. My wife and myself alone have 3 million differences in our genetics. And that's why hypothetically, if we had 1 million kids, every single kid would be genetically different because we have built-in heterozygosity. So the question to the old Earth creationists is, why aren't there more species in light of what we know? Why are there so few species? And then they will admit they can't make predictions. Okay, because if they are going to acknowledge this position of design diversity, but then try and say we believe in hyperevolution, the problem is in their model, there's too little species now, right? So the old Earth creationists are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The theistic evolutionists at least hold to the overall explanation from the evolutionist side for the origin of genetic diversity. They would, for the most part, I think the scientists at BioLogos would say, yeah, the origin of genetic diversity is the result of mutations over time. So they need millions of years to accumulate enough genetic diversity where that genetic diversity can be used through migration, isolation, recombination, gene conversion, okay? Subpopulations branching off from a greater population where there will eventually be enough genetic distinctiveness where we have a new species. The creation model, those DNA differences are already built in from the start, and they still can't comprehend that. So if the old Earth creationists want to hold on to that model, which makes sense scientifically and biblically, they now have the problem, why are there so few species? And they can't answer that. So right here in this article, Does BioLogos Strive for Dialogue? A gigantic difference between YEC and evolution traces to the source of what? Remember, we explained this, of genetic variety we see today. As I published, Nathaniel Jensen's talking, previously and discussed in great depth, which these old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists are obviously not up to date on, or else they would not be repeating the same straw man arguments, okay? Darwinists think all genetic differences are due to mutation. And here's what's funny too, is the evolutionist wants to say that mutations add the novelty necessary for true innovation and true improvements in, let's say, phenotypic complexity, the evolution of higher life forms, even though the type of variation, Matt, that you get for mutations, right, is like the type of variation you get in your car when you're parked at the grocery store and unfortunately a grocery cart hits your car and now you got a dent, or the rust spots or scratches. That's the type of variation you get from mutations. Okay, that's why what we see in terms of DNA function and in terms of these variation-inducing genetic elements, we see that the vast majority of beneficial variation is front-loaded. That makes the most sense. That's why the theistic evolutionists don't have a case. And that's what at least the old Earth creationists recognize, that mutations are degrading. Mutations do not produce beneficial variation. Okay, mutations create disease. One single point mutation can kill somebody. Then the old Earth creationists are stuck between a rock and a hard place because now they have to acknowledge the validity of front-loaded genetic diversity, but now they have to explain, well, why are there so few species? If we're seeing new species and rapid adaptive episodes today, and yet there's only really just thousands of species when there should be far more. So I want to get through this, and then I'll hand it over to you, brother. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen says, I have argued that most differences between species are due to shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. So here's another important part. We as creationists look back to the creation event, and we look back to the expansion of genetic information, okay? We look back to the creation event, and we see a greater ability to diversify, speciate, and adapt. The evolutionists, the theistic evolutionists like Sentinel Apologetics, who could not defend universal common ancestry through the scientific data, and I challenge him to debate the topic, is all life related through common ancestry? And I think that debate will turn out something similar to my debate with Bill Tavis, but we'll see if he accepts that challenge. So they look back to, okay, the creation event, essentially. Let's say you go back to a single cell-like ancestor billions of years ago. They look back to not the expansion of genetic information like we look to, okay? They look back to the contraction of genetic information because they need to add genetic and phenotypic complexity from a single cell-like ancestor to a multi-celled ancestor to a fish, to an amphibian, right? To a reptile, to a mammal, to man. That requires true novelty, increases in complexity, okay? So two different starting points and therefore two different expectations, and that's why we are winning the battle in terms of the gold standard of science, which is predictions, and we're making predictions on DNA function, and they come true more and more every single day. So Dr. Nathaniel Jensen points out, this singular difference in the source of genetic variety has massive consequences for how new species can form and for the limits of speciation. See, we can recognize that as time goes on and more shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity occur, species are going to hit walls where they now have a lesser ability to speciate. Look at a Chihuahua. That's reached a wall, right? There's not much allelic variability there in a Chihuahua. Duff doesn't appear to have read this paper. See, Joel Duff, he's the guy that we're reviewing here. And he's their go-to guy when it comes to speciation and attacking the young Earth creation model. He's got nothing. He's not up to date on the evidence. He can't stand up to young Earth creation predictions. If he has, he's deliberately, notice this, deliberately clouding, dishonestly, the clear and enormous distinctions between YEC and evolution by his shallow descriptions. Returning to Duff's overall point, is there really no evidence for rapid speciation as Duff asserts? The lay-level summaries of the technical papers that I've written on this topic discuss multiple lines of evidence that support the YEC model. Everything from Darwin's own writings to modern genetics. Since Duff makes no attempt to interact with this literature, we have no evidence that he's aware of it. And we see this, unfortunately, with people like Sentinel Apologetics, people like Inspiring Philosophy. They're not up to date on the data. They're not making their own predictions. They're not even able to reiterate our own predictions. If you ask them oftentimes, what's the starting point from your model in terms of the origin of genetic diversity, they'll look at you with a blank look on their face. Okay. Now, there are some theistic evolutionists in the chat now, so hopefully now they finally stop strawmanning the position and finally start putting forth some predictions of their own. Anyways, that's my thoughts for there, brother. That was a rant. Go ahead. I'll hand it to you.
No, I like it because it's exactly what you've been talking about. This guy, essentially, he's just upset. And he's upset in general that we've realized that species is something that can happen rapidly. And he's trying to say that because speciation happens rapidly, therefore you believe in evolution. Nothing could be further from the truth because they don't even know how speciation really occurs deep down. So to say that we believe in evolution when we don't even believe the same mechanisms of evolution that them, they don't even know what they're talking about. And let me explain that. Remember, they need beneficial mutations. If you're going to take a dog-like small land mammal and you're going to turn it into a whale, think about how many beneficial mutations you're going to need for that to take place. You're going to need a vast amount of beneficial mutations, and that's going to take a vast amount of time, if that were possible whatsoever. So our beneficial mutations are what's taking something from an arc animal like a sloth to all the different sloth species? No, of course it's not. It's some natural selection. These things happen quickly. There's epigenetic factors that can make a white wolf or a black wolf. All these factors that play into it, just simple migration, allows for fast speciation. It's not the same model. It's not the same mechanisms. So to say that it's hyper fast when it's exactly opposite in mechanisms shows you right there they're already either straw manning you or they don't understand what their own model or our model actually says about the two. They literally admit that for evolution to be true, you need vast amounts of beneficial mutations. We're saying that speciation happens quickly, and what do we see? We see exactly that. We look over here. Remember this? This was a great one right here. This is from a secular journal as well. And they're like, we can't believe how fast speciation actually occurs. Right? Adaptation is happening right under our noses, right in our own lifetime. Exactly what was not predicted. And then we go over and what do we see? We can look at anything. I don't care. Pick snakes, pick birds. There's some birds for you. Remember, Darwin predicted the exact opposite of what we found. If there's 3.3 years, we're getting a new species of bird when we're looking at them. Well, you track that back to the flood. How many bird species are there total? 18,000. 3.3 years per bird family. What do you have? Exactly what we see. He says there's no genetic boundaries. Oh, look at that. There's a genetic boundary. Clear line, which you can see. Guess that shouldn't have been there, right? And what they say about it? Oh, I fought against that as hard as I could. Gotta love it. You gotta love it. And then we have snakes. We can go down the list on these later. I'm sure we're going to. And what happens in these studies? Look, in the past, scientists believed that larger animals could not respond or evolve quickly to invasive species. He said, now we are waiting to see how this bird will continue to change. He's talking about the Darwin's Galapagos finch because it's so popular. And they're just waiting in their own lifetime. They're like, I wonder when it's going to speciate into next, right in front of our eyes.
Right in front of our very own eyes.
Yeah.
And guess what? And we have, and I'd like to know any theistic evolutionists, old Earth creationists in the chat. And if you haven't, that's fine. Don't be ashamed. But I definitely recommend you read a few technical papers coming out of the young Earth creationist literature where we have predictions, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, on how many species should be forming in lizards, amphibians, right? In birds. We have these predictions on paper in some highly technical work. And they're not being challenged because the theistic evolutionists and the old Earth creationists are still living in straw man world. They're not even on our level, on the level of the young Earth creationists. And I want to play this one clip real quick, brother, and then I'm going to hand it back to you because it's so important on what you're saying with the bird species, right, brother? Yeah. Dr. Jensen he presented this recently in a debate, okay? And I'm going to play it real quick here, and then I'm going to give some comments on it.
Made other predictions, one of them being related to the, as I implied earlier, the rate at which species form. I want to tell you about a research finding that was published 4 months after my book came out. So this was published in October of 2017. 4 months later, a result in Darwin's Finches was published. But I want to set up the question for you here momentarily. There's around 11,000 bird species alive in the globe today. Here's how you could derive a prediction from the young Earth view. So as I mentioned earlier, young Earthers believe that species have descended from the kinds, the types that were on board the Ark of Noah. And so young Earth creationists would explain these 11,000 species by primarily natural processes. And I said that the young Earth creationists put the timing of the flood about 4,500 years ago. So you can then make a prediction about the average rate of speciation. 11,000 species divided by 4,500 years gives you an average rate of about 2 to 3 new species per year. There can be fluctuations within that. This is just a general average so we can move the discussion forward. And we can contrast that to the evolutionary view. And of course, birds would be the descendants of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs go extinct 65 million years ago. If you look at the evolutionary literature, modern birds would begin evolving around 35 million years ago. And so the average rate of speciation would be about 1 new species every 3,000 years. My point here is to show you that there's orders of magnitude difference in these two predictions. as you might expect, because the timescales are orders of magnitude different. Well, the finding in Darwin's Finches was this. In 1981, a male of the large cactus finch, so that's in the box on the upper left, mated with several females of the medium ground finch, which is the box near the center. And one particular lineage, which the Peter and Rosemary Grant, the Princeton researchers who've been doing this for 40 years, they call this the big bird lineage. What they observed over time was that this particular bird species became reproductively isolated, genetically distinct, and morphologically distinct. It's got a different beak size. So everything that defines a new species has been identified here, and this was the paper in January 2018. What I want to focus on is the implications for the rate at which species form. So before this discovery, based on a 2015 paper in Nature, there were 18 recognized species of Darwin's finches. They were announced to the scientific community thanks to Darwin's voyage around the globe. He and Gould announced them in 1837, hence they bear his name. That's 181 years before 2018. So that's in the Galapagos, about one new species every 181 years. That's a simple, straightforward calculation. 1 divided by 100 is 0.01. 1 divided by 200 is 0.005. Both of those are a whole lot less than my predicted rate of 2 to 3 new species per year. However, I was making a prediction for the globe, not for the Galapagos. And so if you apply a conversion factor, convert the fact that we've been looking just at 18 species and apply that rate to the rest of the globe, divide by 18 times 11,000. What's the result that you get? So let's set these numbers in a row. The first number is 1 new species every 3,000 years. The second number is the number I just derived for you from a young Earth perspective. And the third number here is what you do if you go 1 new species divided by 181 years, divided by 18 times 11,000, you get 3.4 new bird species per year, which is exactly in line with what I predicted. My point here is that the young Earth model is working. It's making predictions that future observations could reveal to be true or false. You can find more about that on our website, of course not in the book because it's a prediction. I have got a second article online that deals with the mechanism by which these species form, which also fits the mechanism that I laid out in the book. I also want to tell you about research that's hopefully going to be published before.
So what we're seeing here is, as Dr. Jensen pointed out, right, Matt, the young Earth creation model of speciation is working. We're making predictions, and in real time, we are seeing the confirmation of those predictions, okay? So if we're seeing, okay, new bird species form, okay, before our very own eyes in real time, and we've only got between 12 and 18,000 bird species, which, based on the speciation rate, goes back perfectly 4,500 years ago to a handful of bird kinds, right, brother?
Yeah.
Let's look at the evolutionary model. They believe birds today, modern birds, descend from what? Theropod-like dinosaurs a few 100 million years ago, let's say. Okay, given the known rate of speciation, why are there only 12 to 18,000 bird species? Or why are there only, a couple thousand species or a few thousand species of snakes, lizards, and we can go down the line, only 1,000 species of bats, right? All perfectly in line with the young Earth creation model. But yet the evolutionists want us to believe that these 12 to 18,000 bird species go back a few 100 million years
Right.
to the age of dinosaurs. And their excuse for why they can't make predictions or why the numbers are not in line with their model is what? Is because too many extinction events.
Right.
But you see how we don't have to make up a story? We can actually make predictions from our starting point of a flood bottleneck. That's our extinction event, right? The flood bottleneck 4,500 years ago. So Smokey's saying here, gives a super chat. I'd be curious as to your thoughts, brother, in light of everything we said. I appreciate the support, Smokey. He says, how many species have gone extinct and how many should we have had with an old Earth model? Well, given just bird species, and remember, we're being generous to them, right, Matt? We're going to bird species because bird species, there's a lot. We're going with the hardest species. Most species, there's only a few. Bear species, what is there, 8?
Yeah.
Felid species, canid species, bats, rabbits, lizards. There's not a lot. It's all perfectly in line with our model.
Yeah.
Way too few for the evolutionary model. So point is, why are there not millions and millions of species? And how would what are your thoughts on this then?
Whoops, wrong photo. Usually what I would say is that all you have to do is take how many we know now is a speciation rate for animals, for birds specifically at 3.3, and then you multiply that times how long you believe the last global bottleneck was. Now, let's assume the most beneficial thing for your scenario. Birds were reduced all the way down to a single pair. All the way down. Now, we're talking 200,000 years. Multiply that. Let's say that all birds came from a single bird common ancestor directly off that. Right? Say no other bird species survived whatsoever. 200,000 times 3.3. Now, let's say that half of those died. Half of every single one of those species was so dumb they walked into a volcano and died immediately. Guess what that number is? It's still far, far, far too high compared to what we observe today. So, and that's given half all birds went extinct from 200,000 years. So let's do that. 200,000 years times 3.3. We're looking at 666,000. So you multiply that in half, right? You're talking 333,000 bird species should exist with the current rate of speciation from what we know about birds. So now we can extrapolate that it would have been even faster after a bottleneck, because birds aren't just going to sit there and walk around. They have wings, they fly, they migrate, and they diversify, and they speciate rapidly after a global bottleneck would have happened, right? And so even given the best case scenario for evolution with a bottleneck killing all birds in existence except for 2, and everything happens favorably for you guys, you still have a number that's so astronomically high, it can't possibly be true. So what are you going to do?
Exactly. So even accounting for extinction events, way too few, but yet they're the ones that want to invoke extinction event after extinction event because they can't actually make the prediction. So here's the thing. Right. The biblical model of speciation is science, because we're meeting the gold standard of science. We're making testable predictions, and we're seeing the confirmation of them in real time. We're not afraid to do it. Just like on DNA function, we're not afraid to do it. The old Earth Creationists and the Theistic Evolutionists, they're not making predictions because there's too many variables to consider, and it's an admittance of defeat. They're not meeting the gold standard of science, and we can do it for them. We can be generous like you just did, account for extinction events, and it's still not in line with their model. So here's what's funny, man. Then we're going to go back to the video, play another 5 minutes, and give our comments, because these videos are just so easy to debunk. We got a great chat, 60 people in the chat. Anybody in the chat who's a theistic evolutionist, old Earth creationist, give us your best objections. That's what we do here. We make these interactive. This model of young Earth creation and the biblical model of ancestry, it is strong and powerful. I'd love to see some objections or some better testable predictions. I don't think we're going to get them. Okay. So the point is, Matt, they want to use this speciation argument against us. But when you're up to date on the literature, it's actually they who have the speciation problem. And yet it's perfectly in line with don't you find that funny? I find it funny whenever I hear this hyper evolution argument. It's like, don't you guys realize the number of species on the planet today is a strong argument for our model and not yours? It's right. Like, is this the Twilight Zone? Go ahead, brother. What are your thoughts?
No, it's funny too, because we've realized from looking at these different varieties, it's a little bit hard with bears, right? If there's only 8 of them, we might not see a speciation event. But then we can take a dog and we can breed them, and we can get a new species of dog, right? A new breed of dog, and it can happen so quickly. And we're going to get into that because he specifically points at pictures later in the video of animals he says can't exist based on the young Earth creation model. So we're going to get into that. Another fun one is when we look at lizards, how many lizard species are there today? We can look down, we see about 4,715, somewhere around there. And what did we find? They speciate about once a year. I mean, you couldn't be more on par with what we're seeing, with what's lining up. I mean, it's so perfect. So sometimes speciation events might happen faster. We say, of course it would, especially after the flood. So the numbers are so consistent. I mean, what are the odds that keeps
Matt, look, just like you said, look at the amount of lizard species.
Yeah, look at that, perfectly in line. I mean, it's just,
wait a minute. You'd almost think there was a flood bottleneck 4,500 years ago, eh, brother?
Yeah, with the genetic diversity resetting in all life that we now know happened. I mean, they're completely screwed to say that the flood wasn't global, because now we have evidence that all aquatic life and all land life died all at the same time. So that's when you get horrible arguments, though. They're like, well, why didn't Noah bring the flounder with him, or something ridiculous? It's like they're forgetting the purpose of what the flood was. We're going to get into that as well, because he's making a big deal out of something regarding Noah's flood that really doesn't matter. The flood happened for a reason. We're going to get into that. It wasn't to save all the flounders and all the Tyrannosaurus rexes. Okay, I'm sorry, but
notice, Matt, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds, 34,000 species. I mean, based on what we know in terms of epigenetic adaptation, rapid speciation, the fact that these speciation events that we're seeing in real time are the result of shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, which is exactly what was predicted from the young Earth creation starting point of created nuclear heterozygosity. I mean, you have to pretty much, like that picture we show where Dr. Swamidas is wearing a blindfold reading a young Earth creationist paper. That's the only way. I mean, aquatic, tens of thousands of species, 1.6 million species on Earth. Like you said, brother, I mean, the lizard, look at the snake species. 3,600 known species of snakes in the world. Okay, here we go. New bird species in real time evolved on the Galapagos Island. And we've only just started studying these speciation events. And remember, we're seeing new species form because we've got people on the Galapagos Islands studying these birds. You know, the Earth is a big place, and we don't have eyes on every part of the Earth, right? So we're seeing adaptive events in real time because these are areas and these are species we're studying. What about the species and areas we're not studying? So it's a great time to be a creationist. I still don't see any arguments in the chat, objections or anything like that, because theistic evolution and old Earth creation are extremely indefensible. So let's get back to the video here.
All right.
Any actual rebuttals or testable predictions from anybody in the chat, please put them forth, because at this point you're not meeting the gold standard of science, so you're failing. Okay, so here we go.
I think, drawn to the young Earth interpretation, and even progressive creationists as well, likely would feel that Adam encountered and named the animals that we're familiar with today, that we see around us, not some ancestral version that they wouldn't have recognized at all. However, the young Earth community really has abandoned this view over the last 50 years, except for Homo sapiens. They have even moved beyond the program, who thought that a kind represented a taxonomic level of genus. Right now, a kind corresponds to an entire taxonomic family, and possibly even more, possibly an order. For example, the carnivora might include all meat eating animals, from hyenas to harvest seals, none of which would have existed in that original creation or that Adam would have recognized. He would have only known a common ancestor of all those. So let me look at a brief example of this. Let's go back to these carnivores. This image is an example of the proposed creation and diversification model, starting with the ancestors of different carnivores at the family level. So we have an initial cat kind, we have a different dog kind, bear kind, and so forth. Followed by then an adaptation into the many species that we see today, including many extinct species. If we enlarge this figure, or we look a little bit closer, we'll find that answers in Genesis, if you go to the Ark Encounter, they actually have on display the original dog kind and the original cat kind, and they are pretty much what paleontologists think is the common ancestor to those particular families. And if I zoom this in a little bit, you'll see that this is what they may have looked like. Now, I don't know if you're, I think you're as an astute observer as I am as a scientist. If you look at these images, you may be struck by the fact that all the common ancestors of these different families look very similar to one another. Right? So you notice that the basal or ancestral kinds, the things that presumably are on the...
Go ahead, brother.
Okay, this might take a minute, but there was a lot said there, and I don't think that people realize it. One, I think the problem is that the guy says at 5 minutes and 18 seconds that the only difference between our models is that kinds were created, and in his model, kinds evolved. So basically, I don't know if he's actually saying this, but maybe is that basically a single carnivore was created by God, and it evolved into all the carnivores that we see today. He said that's why Adam would have never known what a walrus is and a hyena, because their common ancestor looks so different that Adam would have never seen either of the two that exist today, because he would have only known the common ancestor. So maybe he actually believes that God created some kind of carnivore as a basal ancestor to all carnivores that we see today. Another one is that, go ahead.
From my understanding, I think, and I could be wrong, like Joel Duff, Joshua Swami Das, those at BioLogos, I do believe they hold to universal common ancestry in almost the same way as the atheistic evolutionists, where even many of them have even tried to defend abiogenesis, as in maybe even that's plausible. So they're pretty well just atheistic evolutionists with a little bit of God of the gaps, as in
So all of Genesis is wrong, then, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right, so yes, Adam named animals based on his knowledge that God gave him, and I'm going to try to prove this with linguistics. So I'm going to do that with this guy's work. Okay, this is a linguistic master, and he is awesome. So if you guys have never heard of this guy, this is the way to go. So basically, what they did is I would say that Adam based a lot of animals based on what they looked like. So and possibly what they did. We're not sure how long they were standing in front of Adam for him to take his time to name these things. But in his own language, they would have most likely retained some of the features and characteristics that we associate with the species even today. A sloth now was a sloth back then, except for like maybe a gigantic version of one, because the Earth's conditions before the flood would have allowed it, right? But still clearly and visually a sloth that even a child would recognize as a sloth. When we go to a museum, they see a gigantic sloth thing, and you see the bones, and then you see the picture of what it would look like. Still a sloth. Same with an armadillo, same with a penguin, same with a wolf. You're right. Okay, well, it was a dire wolf, and then there was a saber-toothed cat instead of a regular cat. Big deal. They're still identifiable. Now, regarding Paleo-Hebrew, if this was Adam's original language, which he calls Edenics, it's the Edenic word for it. What words would he have used going back this far? Now, evolutionists would have us believe that a giraffe never existed from the start. They believe that this creature slowly evolved, and the next only existed more. Their long necks, only existed more recently. Right? They evolved from trying to reach tall trees and branches, and only evolved in a small region of the world, in Africa, down in South Africa alone. Yet Paleo-Hebrew says otherwise. Now, why would a language that goes so far back to being like the original root language of all languages have a word for an animal that they've never seen, ever? So that's to contemplate before we get more into linguistics, because he brings up the giraffe again. So I want to take you to the Paleo-Hebrew word for giraffe and shock you in a little bit. So we'll come back.
And hold that thought, brother. I want you to continue. There's so many questions coming through in the chat. I want to at least get to a couple of them. I'll answer them real quick, just so you don't lose your train of thought. But Luke asked a good question. He says, in your model, you expect the number of species to tend to infinity. So our position would state, Matt, and correct me if I'm wrong, as we were explaining earlier, we would look back to the creation event, right? And we'd look back to the expansion of allelic variability. We'd have the most amount of heterozygosity at creation. Okay. So as time goes on, we lose in terms of species and their internal genetic diversity. We lose more and more levels of heterozygosity. We get increases in homozygosity, decreases in heterozygosity. So eventually we see that oftentimes with artificial selection, as we see species reach a wall, right? They get to a point where the allelic variability and the potential to speciate has been minimized. It's been lost. So no, I wouldn't say that species can, new species can form exponentially to infinity, because eventually you reach walls where if you were to take two Chihuahuas, you just don't have the allelic variability to breed wolves. But if you took two wolves, you've got enough genetic potential to create through artificial selection Chihuahuas, Great Danes, all your domestic dogs. What are your thoughts, brother Matt?
Yeah, we're not seeing anything more right? You can only get less from these things. So whatever came off the ark, that was what we were stuck with the genetic variability based on whatever that species had. And so therefore, when they migrated around the world, yes, we can see some diversity go up because they're expanding, they're migrating. And then all of a sudden, now the world is saturated. We can only see a downward trajectory because that's all that's left as availability goes. Now, if the Earth was 10 times the size and they were still expanding, obviously by now it would still be full. But regardless, there would have been maybe a little bit more genetic diversity. But now we're stuck. We're stuck with whatever was on the ark, and we're stuck with a saturated world with animals where every speciation event adds a little bit less diversity. And so right now we know, like, for example, water buffalo, they came from another species of buffalo, and now they're more homozygous. And most of the time animals aren't tested for that, but when they are, they always see less genetic information. So,
and then what are your thoughts on this? As a response to what we were saying about the bird species, the scientific claim is that the 56 bird species took 3 million years or so to emerge from an ancestor species. These species are birds, but seem to emerge slowly or inconsistently. What are your thoughts on that from the evolutionist perspective?
What 56 species?
I think he's talking about the Galapagos Island.
Oh, well, anytime you are dealing with an isolated event like an island, you're going to get less speciation, essentially, because what happened is when you get landlocked, there's going to be less diversity because interbreeding happens quite often. And so the more interbreeding, the less diversity, the less speciation is going to happen. And then they need to eventually speciate so they can survive, so that there's no more interbreeding problem. So what happens is you get like a new speciation event, and the bird might never be able to speciate with that other one again, so that you're not getting an inbreeding problem. So the speciation is actually very helpful. Humans can't really do it. The only benefit to us is we're like reproducing animals that like populate the entire world. So our diversity was pretty good. We expanded rapidly and went everywhere. And even within us, the diversity is still extremely low. Birds can fly though. Birds can get away from a lot of areas, but the Galapagos is really isolated. And so you're really dealing with like weird creatures that are really landlocked and stuck right there, like the Komodo dragon, I think, is there. Things like that. They're not found many other places, because once they get there, it's going to be really hard to go away. You risk death, essentially.
Right. Great question. There was one more here that I wanted to get to and then give you back the floor, but I think I might have lost it. It was a question that had to do with, do we assume that, oh, here we go. If species can emerge quickly, why is the assumption that they always do?
Well, I guess we don't have to say that they always do, because look at bears. They almost never speciate, and there's only 8 of them, right? So apparently it's not always true for everything, but we don't have to assume that Noah just had one type of bird on the ark. We know he had a raven and a dove. Both were released. So there's 2 different birds we know for a fact were on the ark, but we don't have any indication of what a cat was on the ark, because nothing was mentioned for them. So if we look at the bird families, we see a couple hundred might have been on the ark. There's a lot more variability already on the ark than there would have been for, like, let's say a bear. Let's say that Noah was, well, God sent him the animals. So it wasn't Noah going out and throwing animals in his backpack and carrying them on the ark. They walked to him, whatever they were. So let's say a couple bears walked on the ark. Okay, well, now you've only got a couple bears getting off, and you almost see no speciation happening within them whatsoever. We have how many extinct bears? Like 2 or 3 kinds, and a cave bear.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's why we are, just like with molecular clocks, we're looking at the species that we would predict from our starting point are within the same kind. And that's where we're making the predictions that flow from that, right? And the same thing with species is each species and the speciation rate and the number of species we have today may be different, and we have to account for those, like just like with molecular clocks, right? We need to account for generation times, and that's where our prediction comes into play. So if you remember Adam Heap that we debated, he asked us kind of the same question. Why are there some animals then where there's really only like one species? You know, why, you know, how do you make predictions on that? What are your thoughts on that, brother?
On which ones? How do you make predictions on what?
For example, here, Cool Jesus says, why do some animals, and he named a couple,
Sorry. Yeah.
not diversify, each or one kind, if all had built-in heterozygosity?
Oh, well, there might not be a reason to diversify either, because think about birds. Birds migrate. They travel around the world. Some like cold regions, others don't. Others are forced to, others are not. So there's a lot of diversity in something that can move about and really, really travel like that. As where when you get more, as I was saying earlier, more landlocked, you sometimes there's no real reason for a lot of diversity because there's no reason for it. Yeah, the environment is going to be indicative to a speciation event, to adaptation, to what's going on in the environment. So that's why a lot of things that survived going into Africa after the flood, because going north meant almost certain death. That's why there's no longer the dire wolf. That's why there's no longer a mammoth. And that's why the humans, which we call Neanderthal, became reductive, inbred, and died, because they were unable to speciate. They were unable to save themselves. The genetic diversity got so low that they died. The same thing happened with the mammoth. The mammoth eventually inbred and died. There was not enough genetic diversity for them to keep living because of what they did. So,
and that's why a lot of the times what you're saying, it comes down to the genetics. We need to see, for example, the Neanderthals, we look at their runs of homozygosity and we see that they are the most inbred people on the planet. So obviously they're not going to have a lot of genetic potential for change. They're not going to have, because they have more runs of homozygosity. So a lot of the times we got to consider that in the species that we're actually sequencing in terms of the genetics. So those are some good points, brother. Anyways, it looks like we got through most. There's a couple other questions, but we're going to, for example, about fossil species, we're going to talk about that a little later when Joel Duff brings it up anyway. So I'll give you back the floor, brother. We're all up to date on questions now.
Okay. I guess I'll run through this one real quick. So did Adam and Eve see a pug? Did Adam see a pug and a chihuahua? Obviously not. He saw something that was probably more like a wolf, and it was named after that. Would a child ever consider like a greyhound or a whippet, one of those really long dogs, consider it a deer? No, and deers have a lot of variety within them. How about a pit bull or a husky? Would they confuse that to be a bear? Well, no, of course not. But yet, even though these animals are both four-legged, and they both walk the same, and they both have body fur, and they both have the same structure, yet we can tell them apart from being different kinds. That's still pretty phenomenal to me. And considering a lot of dinosaurs, four-legged, it's just, you see a lot of the same structure and design in nature, but yet there's diversity. It's very, very peculiar that we're still able to see such a thing. Then he starts complaining that we can go all the way up to the order level was on the ark, but that's really high. But here's the thing. Those taxonomic things change all the time. So you can't just say, it's not just like a set in stone thing where we can just point to everything and be like, that's on the family level. Everything is on the family level that was on the ark. You just can't do that because that classification system has changed a lot, and they move it around themselves. So nothing's just completely set in stone because taxonomy is not set in stone. It's a subjective field that's based on assumption. So when he tells the common ancestor of the hyena and harvest seal, that was interesting to me. Basically, was he just saying that the common ancestor to the hyena and the harvest seal was on the ark, and that's what the young Earth creation view is? I wasn't really sure about that, but I'll just tell the audience, no, that's not what we agree to, because we don't believe in the hyperevolution where things change from one kind to another family level. You're not moving those family levels, even from a basal ancestor. It's the taxonomic change that he's is angry about on the levels. But if you notice that chart in the video, you can even bring it up and just leave it on pause so everyone can see it. I want people to go along with what I'm going to show them. Whenever you get a chance, put it back up there. I want you to look at that spiraling thing that he.
Which one is it, brother?
Just in the video.
Oh, yeah. You want me to go back to the video?
Yeah, and keep it on pause, and I'm going to show people what they're looking at essentially. I want to. Good. Yeah, full screen that sucker. Okay, if you look over to the left, or on the bottom left, you'll see a bear down there on the bottom, and then you'll look up and you'll see a bear dog, right? But yet that's not what we believe at all. We believe it was probably a cave bear which was the ancestor that was probably on the ark. If you look on the left, you see cats, but yet he shows some weird common ancestor like a myacid. That's this thing. These are almost like myasids. They have nothing to do with what Answers in Genesis or us believe. These things are nothing like cats at all. They don't have retractable claws. They're not cats. This is what Answers in Genesis actually says, and it's of the cat kind. Shocker, I know. So me, it's really peculiar that he's showing not the ancestor to all cats. He's showing like a basal ancestor, so he can say, look at how similar they all look. But this is not what is believed at all, especially by us. He's trying to go further back, as far back as he can, to show that they look a little bit more similar to one another than they do today. But there's no genetic evidence for that whatsoever. First of all, these myacid-like creatures on the left that he's showing as the common ancestor to cats. At least there it is. It's on the left upper in the red box area. That exactly, those myacid-like creatures are nothing like cats. They have totally different teeth, totally different skull shapes. They have claws that don't retract. They're permanently extracted like a bear, basically. Their tails are longer than their bodies, even though their bodies are very extremely long and slender. They also lack a hollow, bony structure that encloses their inner ears. In all cats, basically, it's included. It's crazy to me that they're saying that this is the basal ancestor of a cat, but it doesn't retain any of the features of that all cats share today. So that is bizarre to me, because if you look at baraminology, when you're looking at these things, that's how we're trying to determine, also looking at just fossils, by the way, this is no genetics, what is related. And when you do use it, we see clear delineation between different species of the same kind. And that shouldn't be that way if evolution were true. So these people are making awful phylogenetic assumptions, somehow thinking that animals should not share any physical characteristics, because if they do, then it's evidence for common ancestry. That's that same dumb argument that they use with humans, that apparently we shouldn't share any physical similarities to anything in the animal kingdom. We should be magically created 100% different than every other life form. It's just that really bad argument to me. So because we find more, matter of fact, just play the video. I'll get into it again as we go. I just can't help myself.
I'm just going to reshare and make sure that it's the audio's on, and I want to say one God is now here. I think I said it right that time, brother. I appreciate the amazing support. You guys are awesome. Like I said, you guys are the life and blood of this channel and ministry. One God is now here. Thanks for the super chat. Says, God has blessed Team SFT. Now will God's people step up and be a blessing? Let's support the mammoth effort it takes to expose and unpack the evolution story. So we've been blessed. Ram, Adam, myself, we've been doing full-time ministry for a while now because of the amazing support of you guys. And you guys are the life and blood of this ministry and channel. So we've got a lot more to come. Matt can attest to the fact that we've probably got unlimited projects, guys. So thank you so much. And, we appreciate the support. So another thing I wanted to say, Brother Matt, before we move on is, to believe in hyperspeciation. Like, for example, if we're hyper-evolutionists, we would then have to agree with the evolutionists when it comes to the origin of genetic diversity. The evolutionist does not invoke created nuclear heterozygosity, okay, which is another reason why they can't make predictions on DNA function. The epigenetic changes that we see, the rapid adaptive episodes we see, is contradictory to their past claims about how long it takes to speciate and adapt. Okay, so if we were hyper-evolutionists, then we would have to agree with them that the vast majority of DNA differences, especially in the nuclear genome, is a result of mutations. We would have to say these mutations would have to build up, okay, enough for recombination gene conversion to act upon. And then obviously other processes like migration, breakaway populations, isolation, shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, all within a few thousand years. That would be hyperevolution. But we're saying the DNA differences were front-loaded, They say it's post hoc. We've already spent considerable amounts of time showing why the predictions that flow from this hypothesis have been confirmed more and more. So it's just a straw man argument. It's a misunderstanding of the evolutionary model and the creation model. Okay, so we aren't saying, and we've talked about it in one of our past streams, Debunking Simon Dan, how we can identify what's a created allele and what's due to mutation. And we looked to the rare alleles, okay, the allele frequencies around the globe. We've looked to that which is common and not disease causing and also functional, and we can safely say that those are created, okay? So the point is, this argument, if I see theistic evolutionists and old Earth creationists put forth this argument, it just automatically tells me every single time that they are knocking down a straw man, claiming victory, okay? They're not actually putting forth better testable predictions. So I just want to point that out. That anybody who says young Earth creationists believe in hyperevolution must then believe that we explain the origin of genetic diversity as a result of mutations. And we don't. We acknowledge that mutations create negative variation, like the dings and scratches and dents and rust marks on your car. Mutations lead to disease, okay? Mutations are just a small source of genetic variation. That's why we look to the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, okay, where the Y chromosomes pass down from the father, mitochondrial DNA from the mother, and therefore we can make predictions because we can agree with the evolutionists that these DNA differences are the result of mutations over time. So now we got a head-to-head prediction. And yet, what do we see? Low variation in the Y chromosome, low variation in the mitochondrial DNA, just a few DNA differences separating any two people. Given the fast molecular clocks in Y chromosome, mitochondrial DNA, those mutations in DNA differences only go back a few thousand years. So we have confirmation of separate ancestry from the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. And we've got confirmation for separate ancestry in the nuclear genome because the created heterozygosity hypothesis predicts what? DNA function, predicts function in these elements such as endogenous retroviruses, ALU sequences, other classes of retrotransposons. We predict function in pseudogenes. We predict evidence for forward thinking. We see that in terms of epigenetics, which points us back to the forward thinker. So what do we have? The nuclear genetic compartment, the mitochondrial DNA compartment, and the Y chromosome all confirm and support separate ancestry. So the evolutionists essentially are left with nothing. So that was long-winded, I know, brother, but let's share screen again and get this party started.
The species from which were derived from them. Right? Who's to say that these then aren't really a single kind in themselves? Where's the dividing line? I was supposed to show that a little earlier. But lest you think that, oh, well, the variation within a kind is just, some minor adaptation and a few genetic changes. We would just note that if you look at the variation between the extreme members of the feline kind, there's more genetic variation there, physiological variation, morphological variation maybe in some cases, than there is, we say, chimpanzees and humans, just to draw out the apples to sort of apples comparison here. But let me let Answers in Genesis speak for themselves here. Answers in Genesis says this about carnivore origins. Here's a mitochondrial DNA phylogeny constructed by Answers in Genesis employed.
All right, I can't take it anymore. I already can't take it.
Our own eyes in the previous figure.
All right.
Go ahead, brother.
Before we get into that chart, because I'm sure everyone's staring at that crazy chart that's already on the screen, he basically said something that was astonishing. He said, because we find more morphological differences between cat species, yet we humans have less differences between us and apes, that makes evolution true. Think about that, everyone. Now, obviously, I want you to imagine believing that humans speciate first. Now that you're done rolling your eyes at that, we can move on and say, now, try to imagine that because cats look more different, according to him, a house cat looks so much more different than a lion than we do to a chimpanzee. Therefore, this proves common ancestry. Let's destroy that for real quick. Now, I showed this earlier, but it was while he was talking, and it's just a basic mutation rate. It's showing that there's no possible way there's enough time for these mutations to even exist. And there's too few mutations based on how fast the mutation rate is, based on the split between humans and chimps. Even the biggest critic of all, who had this chart right here, was called Rational Mind. He even made this, and his biggest criticism was that Jensen showed that there could have been more mutations than can actually fit in the mitochondria. He literally didn't even try to deny that the evidence fit perfectly. He just tried to wave his hand so far over here that you were looking at that while he was like, let's change the page real quick. That's horrible for us. So first of all, first question is, how many physical features does a house cat have different between a lion morphologically? That's the real question. But before we go to that, he said, where is the genetic boundary line? Luckily for him, I did an entire study on where to draw the line in ancestry, because I wanted to know where that line is. There's one. There is the line between all humans and all primates. There's the genetic boundary. And how do we know? Because I've shown this before. This is the global bottleneck, Noah's flood. In the evolutionary chart, we don't really know what it was because they don't have anything in their geologic column to say what it was. But they know that there was one because DNA barcoding doesn't lie, and it's 99.999% accurate. So therefore, why is there genetic variation between a pongo or orangutan and a gorilla and a chimpanzee and a human? Well, if they all came through that bottleneck at exactly the same time, then there has to be a reason for it. And that reason is generation time. And so with a fast mutation rate, you're going to find that the one that have the fastest generation time will have more mutation differences. And therefore, that's how phylogenetic charts are built, because they believe genetic diversity determines what species is older, but it's really generational time. The pongo, or on the far right, the orangutan, has a generation time of 11 years, and a gorilla has one of 20 years. So therefore, the pongo will look much older than every other one that you're looking at on your screen. So therefore, evolutionarily wise, they believe that that came first, which now we know that is not true, because that door you see in the background, all of them came through it at the exact same time, because that was the bottleneck. Whether or not you believe it was Noah's flood or a volcano or whatever, it doesn't matter, because it existed and it happened to all life. And therefore, their phylogenetic trees are garbage and mean nothing. Also, using that mutation rate, using the CO1 gene and how fast mutations are, we can show that the genetic boundary is right there. And it's somewhere around, what is that? 22? Yes, the dividing line is 22 mutations. It separates humans from everything else. And we know that based on the mutation rate. So drawing the chart isn't just through this anymore, which is Bermanology. This is the physical differences. That's by looking at morphology like this. This is what most people want to do, because they can go to the fossil record. They can look at the different bone structures, and they can say, well, how many different morphological features are there? This guy wants us to believe that we share more with chimpanzees and primates than cats do with other cats. Unfortunately for him, nothing could be further from the truth. So what we can do is, I'm sorry, I have to upload each of these photos that I'm showing you. What we can do is we can ask the experts. We can say, well, how many physical differences are there between different cats? And they admit that house cats and big cats are nearly identical. Brain size is also nearly identical in structure, even despite the size. So taking a small house cat and enlarging it to the size of a lion would equate to the exact same result. So when looking at a skeleton, a lion is basically just a scaled up cat. So you talk about utter failure when it comes to arguments. The one thing he said was that cats have more differences than humans do to chimps. Couldn't even be further from the truth. The experts say, no, cats are almost identical to one another when you're looking at their bone structures. You can line them up. You can line up the skulls even of every single cat species. And when you're even looking at the skulls, they're identical as well. There's more variety in human being skulls than there are between cat species skulls. So you talk about shooting yourself in the foot with that comment. He should have picked something else, honestly. He would have been better off picking like a deer.
I want to point out a fact too, is if you, and we've got it uploaded on this channel, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen versus Dr. Dennis Venema. And they go into the DNA differences that separate species, and how some species within the same kind that we would say exist within the same kind have more DNA differences separating them than humans and chimpanzees. So why don't we say humans and chimpanzees are the same kind? Well, if they understood the model and the predictions, as Dr. Nathaniel Jensen pointed out, we are not looking at just mere DNA differences. We are looking at what? Molecular clocks, right? We are looking at DNA function. So the amount of DNA differences, or the pattern of DNA differences, the nested hierarchical patterns, they can't really tell us what is and what isn't related. But molecular clocks, as well as DNA barcoding, DNA function, this is what could tell us. And that's why we see humans have low genetic diversity overall, while animals have greater diversity, which makes sense from the biblical starting point, because what does the Bible say in Genesis? God created two people, Adam and Eve. He didn't create just two of every kind of animal. He created populations of animals in fully functioning ecosystems. So right off the bat, we would predict that animals would have greater levels of genetic diversity than humans, who, since we started from two, should have lower levels of genetic diversity. That's exactly what we find. So even if we did find a couple felid species within the felid family that had more differences than humans and chimpanzees, that's what we'd expect anyways from the starting point. And if the theistic evolutionists understand the Bible, we know we have the Tower of Babel event where we've got humans congregate in one spot. They don't follow God's command to spread out, but we have animals who did spread out. So we have humans who essentially have another lesser bottleneck at the Tower of Babel for however many years, once again reducing levels of genetic diversity. Point is, what we find in terms of DNA differences and genetic diversity in humans versus animals is exactly what we'd expect to find. But to actually identify what is and what isn't related, we've made predictions on DNA function, speciation rates, molecular clocks. And it's a great time to be a young Earth creationist, right, Matt? Because we see more and more every single day, these predictions are being confirmed. What are your thoughts, brother?
Oh, I know. It's great too, because they keep putting their foot in their mouth like this guy, right? Like trying to say, well, humans, how dare you say that we're not related to primates when we share more similarity with them based on morphology and bone structure than cats do. And then we look at cats and the experts are like, no, they're identical to one another. You're vastly different. You know what I mean? Look at the bones in the hand. Look at we have a nasal bone. They don't have nose bones. We have foreheads. They don't have foreheads. I mean, the list is so big. That's why I made that chart, because there's vast amounts of different morphological differences and features between us. And then cats, again, not so much. There's even so genetically similar that you can remove the hair off of your house cat and put it on a lion and it will graph. You can take a lion and a tiger and breed them and they'll make a liger. They're not different. They're completely related. I even made a prediction on exactly what cat was probably on the ark and what its mutation rate is and will be found to be, and that they're still increasing in genetic diversity. If deep time evolution is true, why aren't they maxed out in genetic diversity? Your mitochondria can only saturate with so many mutations before it's fully saturated, and then mutations don't show up anymore. They compile. It's like throwing garbage in your trash can. How much trash can you put in there before no more fits and it just starts falling out? Well, that's what your mitochondria is. It's building up with trash and mutations, and eventually it gets to the point where it's saturated. Well, guess what? It's not saturated. So not a lot of time has passed. It should be evident and very obvious and logical that if that's true, then what's going on? How fast are mutations accumulating? Well, that's fast. Well, that's really weird then. It can't be fast and not be full. Well, which one is it? Well, it's both. It's not full and they're fast. So I'm sorry. Evolution's just not true.
It's been overturned. Okay. We started from the Genesis starting point of origins. And the Bible tells us God created two people. So as you're pointing out here, we can look to genetics and we can test this to see if this is supported by the scientific data. And we find a fast mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. We find low variation. The only way you can keep a fast mutation rate and low variation in these DNA compartments is if the mitochondrial DNA compartment and the Y chromosome are young.
Right.
Because, and they never have an answer to this. Let's see if anyone in the chat does. The chimpanzee Y chromosome and the human Y chromosome, less than 35% dissimilar if you consider overall architecture, genetic content, size differences, less than 35% dissimilar.
Oh.
And yet, every single human male Y chromosome, nearly identical, 99.99% identical, low genetic variation. And yet, we find the Y chromosome in humans mutates fast, about 1 mutation per generation. So when you map that out on a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree, we see there's only a few differences that separate any two people. And this can only be true if the Y chromosome is young, and not a couple 100,000 years young, a few thousand years young. I mean, we had Andrew in the chat say, oh, there's no evidence for separate ancestry. What do you think this is? There's yet to be a rebuttal to this other than, well, you're not considering the phylogenetic rate. You're just considering the pedigree rate, which we've already demolished. And 2, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has made a prediction that if what I am saying is true, we should be able to read the history of civilization off of these mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome phylogenetic trees. And he's already put out technical papers and a video series and a recent lecture in a conference held by AIG, which I've watched on the Answers TV, which I highly recommend, showing confirmation of these predictions that yes, we're seeing more genetic signature than we are seeing genetic noise. If the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA compartments go back hundreds of thousands of years, there should be more noise than signature. But yet we see more signature than noise. I mean, it's a great time to be a creationist. They got no rebuttal. I mean, these theistic evolutionists just keep repeating the same arguments over and over again. Sentinel Apologetics puts out this video and probably, no offense to him, but he keeps repeating the same arguments, probably didn't understand a word of what I just said when it comes to these genetic signatures found in these DNA compartments. They're out of date and they're out of touch with reality. Any thoughts before we move on to the next part of this video, brother?
Yeah, sure. So remember, if they're looking, if phylogeny was true and they base the mutation rates off of phylogeny, which is the fossil record, they base it and then they look inside and they have to get a mutation rate that agrees. Anytime they're finding anything that has over 5%, they're like, this doesn't match phylogeny. Remember, it has to be very, very low. Well, they just tested chickens, by the way. This is evolutionist for you, by the way. This isn't young Earth creation. What did they find? Oh, look at that. Uh-oh, they found that the fact that it mutates 15 times faster, that's exactly what we would predict on a young Earth creation model if you were to look at a pedigree rate to get an observable rate of mutations based on how fast mutations actually go back in time, because nothing beats pedigree rates. Basically, you take a parent and then you test the offspring and you see how many new mutations there are, and then you extrapolate back to a point where there's no mutations at all. Every single time they test something, the pedigree rate invalidates the phylogeny rate. And why is that? Because the observation tells the truth. There's no assumption needed. We don't have to invoke anything like the evolutionists do, how they're constantly going, well, maybe selection can probably remove some of these things over time. See, we don't have to play games. We don't have to invent anything. The information is right there, and it points exactly to when we say it was. Game over.
And not to mention, we're going to be doing a whole show on this article, guys, because we're hoping to get Dr. Rob Carter on as well in the next couple of weeks to discuss this paper, because he absolutely decimated, demolished the arguments coming out of Dan Stern Cardinal and Gutsick Gibbon, and really just low-hanging fruit at this point because they haven't offered anything novel in a while. So this was a great article. I highly recommend it. Matt and I both shared it in our community posts, and Dr. Rob Carter pointed out that and I'm only going to go over this part because, like I said, we're going to have a whole show dedicated to this. Hopefully get Dr. Carter on himself. Says he, as in Dan Stern Cardinal, claims I misunderstand the substitution rate per year versus the mutation rate. But hey, remember we put that meme out with the parrot with the picture of Dan's face, because it's been a year now, maybe not quite a year, but feels like it, where although he's been corrected over and over and over and over again, okay, and I know it's not always right to mock these guys, but I'm telling you, when you've been corrected 35 times and shown that your so-called testable prediction is not a testable prediction, it's a retrodiction based on circular reasoning, because you're starting from archaeology and the geological column is in your assuming the deep time scale to make your predictions. When you've corrected them on this over and over again and they still repeat it, they are either willingly ignorant or just willingly lying. So Dr. Carter points out, I am perfectly aware that the long-term substitution rate is not the same as the genealogical mutation rate. However, over long periods of time in a population in mutation drift equilibrium, the two are nearly equal. This is also not, as he claims, a conflict between the thought that A, most mutations are lost to drift, and B, the mutation rate is approximately the same as the fixation rate. Why? Because even if most mutations are lost in a large population, many are not. This is basic population genetics. They know not of what they speak. Mutation rates are difficult to calculate, but genealogical rates have been calculated for the Y chromosome. Okay, so the point is, guys, the substitution rate, the pedigree rate, it's all in line with the biblical model of ancestry, and they've really got nothing now, as you can tell, Matt. So let me go over this super chat, brother. One, God is now here. I appreciate all the support. God bless you. Says, challenge to Evo atheists. Watch Raw Matt take, then dissect Aaron Ra's phylogeny challenge. Amen. And report back how anyone can say with a straight face that Ra actually knows and does science. Not one rebuttal yet to that video, eh, Matt?
Never.
Just goes on, but it's getting a lot of great feedback. So
he'll never refute that. He's a retired. He's over. He can stay on his own channel and pretend he actually does science with his little taxonomic names.
He really is. He really is just forced into retirement by the technical arguments, right? So we've got here, I totally agree. Lucy Black says, Raw Matt for president 2025. Amen, brother. Amen. I'd vote for you. So that being said, my good man, let's share screen and get through some more of this, this video.
The common ancestors for each carnivore kind are indicated by Jensen as these circles. The circle represents where the common origin is. Right? Notice that each carnivore kind, common ancestor, is more similar to each other than they are to the descendants of those kinds of each other. We might ask, what would stop him from simply expanding his definition of a kind to include all carnivores? A carnivore, in this case, the carnivore kind, which would include cats and dogs. So the really important question, those are examples of sort of the general message you might hear in today's modern, I'd say, neo-creationist view. But what's underlying is, like, what's the explanation for how this could happen? How did all these changes from 2 individuals to hundreds of species, how could that have happened? In order to accomplish these dramatic changes, young Earth models now acknowledge the validity of a number of mechanisms that they once mocked. Here I have listed some of those mechanisms of speciation. Beneficial mutations, not often in the literature, but it is there. Jumping genes, gene duplication, genetic drift, natural selection, vestigial organs occur within these kinds. Genetic imperfections, there's a punctuated equilibrium model of creationist evolution, and even transition fossils. This is the language and the core of mechanisms that we think of as being evolution today. So all this means something that few in the church may have yet realized, and that is young Earth creationists are really young Earth evolutionists. They're accepting many of the concepts of evolution in most senses of the word. And yet they still declare that evolution is evil, which brings us to the obvious question. What are the differences? Right? There must be some differences, and I'm certainly not saying there aren't. Right? This isn't a big kumbaya moment where everyone's going to agree now. There are some significant differences, and we don't deny that those differences don't exist. I'm just going to briefly mention 2 of these. Evolution only occurs within kinds. I think that's fairly apparent. There isn't common ancestry between those. But again, we're having difficulty defining what a kind is. But also, there's front-loaded genetic diversity. New genetic information can't occur in that model. It can only disappear. And so therefore, all the genetic information that was ever existed must have been front-loaded into the original kinds, the original perfect creation. And therefore, everything after that is sort of a spillover effect in which it's all just being separated out into the various little bits of variation that's left in this world. So we commonly see images like this of kinds sort of degrading into lesser and lesser beings, or ones that are mutated. So we have a number of scientific issues. Greg and I would take issue with a number of different aspects of this. I'll just highlight the first two. Genetic variation in their model should be running out over time. In other words, looking toward the future, it's a fairly grim future. There isn't any new genetic information. It can only be lost. And since species are going extinct and mutations are happening, eventually the future a few thousand years ago looks pretty grim in terms of genetic variation and diversity. Our world will be a less diverse place. But let me turn to really a more important topic, the theological impacts of this work.
Okay, so we've got a ton to address there. What I find funny is he acknowledged, kind of like Joshua Swamidas with his TMR4A argument, okay, is they acknowledge the front-loaded genetic diversity, but then they still make the straw man argument that we believe in hyperevolution. Well, that's contradictory. If you're acknowledging the fact that young Earth creationists start with created nuclear heterozygosity and therefore speciation events as the result of reductive evolution and shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, all we need are breakaway populations through migration, isolation. These shifts can occur and we can have genetic distinctiveness to the point where we can label this as a new species. This is the opposite of the evolutionist that literally requires novel genetic information, okay, requires an increase in phenotypic complexity, requires millions of years to build up this genetic diversity, has to explain the epigenome, has to explain these multiple overlapping codes, has to explain so much that we, and rightfully so, as we've demonstrated, start from this position. So I got so much to say in terms of this, brother, but I'm going to hand it to you. I know you got a lot of good stuff to say too. So what are your thoughts on that portion, brother?
Yeah, I mean, he was all over the place. First of all, he's complaining that we believe in some mechanisms of evolution, and we apparently shouldn't. I guess we need to make up our own words. I don't really know what his problem is there. Also, he was mad that where Jensen drew circles, and he goes, you notice those are the common ancestors. It's like, well, first of all, you don't know what those circles even are or why he put them there, because if you knew why he put them there, you know it would be based on mutation rates, and you would know that that's the dividing line. And he goes, so what's stopping him from going back to a common ancestor before that? Mutation rates. Try learning what he's talking about before telling him that he's wrong when you don't even know why those circles are drawn there, nor what the circle even represents as far as the creature goes. You think just because it's farther back on the tree that it's more similar based on your evolutionary tree and what you put in the circle, when I showed you, no, that's not what's in the circle, even based on answers in Genesis. I don't know what to tell you. So I guess we will go and say, I showed earlier that the cat circled in red was not a myacid, which is on the evolutionary chart, or a vivarid. If you follow the hyena back, it's definitely not in line with some kind of was that tusked aquatic animal that he said it was. Anyway, it just seems absolutely crazy because he's straw manning. He's putting something there that doesn't exist in the beginning with. And he's mad at punctuated equilibrium. Well, guess what? Punctuated equilibrium is an evolution, and it's hyperevolution. So you guys even go to hyperevolution when you need it to. You go to gradualism to believe that everything slowly, gradually evolved from Darwinian evolution. And then all of a sudden you look in the fossil record and you see all this life like, oh, that was punctuated equilibrium. Then you find no evolution at all. You're like, oh, that's stasis. So you can claim anything you want in your model, but we can't even have rapid speciation. That's stupid considering we literally see it. Next, he said, how could a bottleneck of 2 cause things to speciate to what we have today? Well, the reason why is because, again, it goes against evolutionary predictions. Look at that. Unexpected heterozygosity in island mouflon sheep population founded by a single pair of individuals. Imagine that. Contradictory to the predictions of evolution. Now, what is this study? In I think like 1850 or 1950s, they dropped 2 sheep off, 1 male, 1 female. They expected them to die. They were just there to produce milk and maybe produce more children. And guess what? They left them on the island when they left from their vacation. And guess what? They populated just fine. And heterozygosity increased as they migrated across the island. Now the island is full of mouflon sheep. and completely contradictory to evolutionary predictions. And now there's more species of the sheep on the island. And guess what? Now they're headed downhill as they have shifted from more hetero to homozygosity. Exactly what we predicted. So I don't know. He obviously doesn't study anything. He doesn't look into the new research. He doesn't investigate. I guess that's fine, but don't tell us we're wrong when you don't know anything about it. And clearly he knows nothing about the rates of speciation. He knows nothing about founder effects, which was that study. He doesn't know how genetic diversity increases because of migration and expansion, which is essentially punctuated equilibrium. I mean, it's awful for this guy. Beneficial mutations he brought up. It's like, oh, please don't tell me because lactose mutation exists in humans that we evolved from chimpanzees. You know, these beneficial mutations are examples of weak things. I mean, the vast majority are so harmful in one way or another. Nobody wants mutations. Nobody. If you were to say, give me a mutation, there's a chance it'll be beneficial. How many would take that on a dice roll? Hopefully nobody with a sane mind would ever do such a thing. So if that's the case, why are you hoping that these beneficial mutations are going to drive something into a better species that it was through and cause macroevolution to happen? When you listen to the experts, they say random mutation influence over the course of time would never do these things. Mutations tend to induce sickness, death, deficiencies. There's no evidence in the vast literature of heredity changes that shows unambiguous evidence that random mutations itself, even in the geographical isolation of populations, leads to speciation. So their foundation essentially is that mutations are the guiding force, but yet mutations do the exact opposite. And every so often when a beneficial mutation arises within something, it's so trivial and it does so little that there is no possible way that a bunch of them will do anything to change you.
Right, great points. Great points. And looks like we've got a great chat tonight. We're trying to get to as many of these questions as possible. Can't believe we've already gone over 2 hours, but there's just so much to say. Joel Duff's actually in the chat. He's the one whose lecture we are commenting on. So I think he's just saying something to what you said earlier, brother. He's saying, I didn't put a myosit on that tree. I put the exact same fossil specimen that AIG uses as their display model as the ARC cat kind.
The one that I found was this from Answers in Genesis. But what does Answers in Genesis even say is the cat kind? So are they just randomly drawing a picture? Because look, they don't say what this is.
Right. And we put out a video, what was that, about a year ago?
Right.
On the possible ARC cat kind. I think when we're looking at fossils, and whatever the original kind was at creation, that's probably near impossible. And correct me if I'm wrong, would we expect to be able to find the original most heterozygous kinds? We're mostly doing our best to trace back to the ARC kinds. And correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. What are your thoughts?
No, we can only go back because of genetics. If we found fossils of a cat, sure, and we can reconstruct it, but we would extrapolate back what it looked like with the fur, right, what it looked like as far as, how, I don't know, just there would be a lot of speculation, especially since we don't have the genetics.
Right.
But it's fine. I mean, morphologically, cats are still cats. We find them in the fossil record. A saber-toothed cat is still a cat.
Right. And that's why we always point out the fact that genetics, and Dr. Jensen pointed this out, genetics, genes, traits, that's what's inherited sperm and egg. That's where we will answer the question of ancestry. A bone found in the dirt is not inherited sperm and egg. Geography is not inherited sperm and egg. A fossil is not inherited sperm and egg. It's genetics that can tell us what is and what isn't related. Okay, when we look at a fossil that has no genetics, how are we then to determine confidently what is the result of homology and what is the result of, say, convergent evolution? Because we know it is a fact that oftentimes today more variation exists within the same species than between species. And these are in families of organisms that we have their genetics, okay, to determine this. And I want to share a screen here on something that so once again, guys, check the description box for a number of articles. dealing with the claims here. Okay, so here's one: shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. So Jensen points out, as I detailed in my technical paper, the primary mechanism by which speciation occurs under the YEC model is not mutation and natural selection. Remember, it's the evolutionists that explain the origin of genetic variation as a result of mutation. No, we don't. Nobody disagrees with natural selection. Natural selection just means differential reproduction. Okay, so the fine-tuning of species to keep them as strong as they can be, that's not going to explain the arrival of the fittest. It might explain the survival of the fittest. Now, natural selection can utilize the design diversity, this internal diversity that we are pointing to, for adaptive purposes, right? For environmental change and adaptation, okay? So he points out it is shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. If Duff wants to argue that breeds, so there is an argument from the Theistic Evolutionists and Old Earth Creationists that the argument we put forth with breeds, right? Because when we look to the variation in breeds, right, Matt, we've got, let's say we've got between 700 and 800 horse breeds. Now, even the evolutionists would agree that these horse breeds must have come about in human history. It's humans that are selecting for these traits through artificial selection. So obviously, these breeds have had to have come about, these hundreds of breeds, with great differences in morphology. Okay, just through the pre-existing genetic diversity, we were able to create all these dog breeds, all these horse breeds. But yet, when you actually look at species in the wild, which oftentimes have more heterozygous sites than these breeds, we see there are far fewer species. Horse species, what is there, about 7? Okay, so you're trying to say we can get hundreds of breeds in human history, but not a few species? The point is, with created nuclear heterozygosity, new species arise easily, and it's done in these shifts that Jensen's pointing out here. Okay, so he points out, if he wants to show skin deep differences, he needs to make his comparison at the level of heterozygosity for it to be relevant to the YEC speciation model. Furthermore, since breeds have more morphological variety than species, he needs to show that species have less heterozygosity, less potential for morphological variety than breeds do. In fact, dog breeds and canid species have overlapping levels of heterozygosity, with slightly higher levels of heterozygosity in species. Okay, so there's just slightly overlapping levels. Consider the implications of this fact. Humans have produced tremendous morphological variety among domestic breeds, much more variety than exists among species in the wild. And they did so by starting with genetic variety that is comparable to that in the wild. In other words, species still have the potential today to produce as much morphological variety as exists among domestic breeds. All that is needed is a shift from heterozygosity to homozygosity in a few individuals, followed by the isolation of these individuals from the remaining heterozygous individuals. Okay, for anybody new in the chat, heterozygous or heterozygosity just means a state of DNA diversity. Going back to basic genetics, think of, you got your alleles, you got capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Okay, if you're a heterozygous at a genetic site, you'd be, capital A, lowercase a. But here's the thing. We need to understand that this needs to apply across the genome. As in, we are looking at millions of sites where there is built-in heterozygosity, which means there's amazing potential for genetic variety. We need to look to the genetic location definition of allele to properly understand this model. There's one other thing I wanted to... okay, so this is why, as you guys have realized here, post-flood speciation is not a problem, okay? And as Matt was pointing out, in short, the population genetic processes of inbreeding, small population sizes, and migration/geographic isolation, in technical terms, okay, shifts from a Hardy Weinberg equilibrium could produce enormous species diversity in 4,500 years or less. Tons of lay-level articles to read as well. In fact, okay, this is what we were pointing out earlier for the old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists. In fact, the abilities of these processes are so strong that the plausibility of post-flood speciation isn't even a valid question anymore. Instead of trying to ask if any species could have arisen in a few thousand years, we may as well ask why more species haven't done so. Why are there not more species? The sources for these are in the description box. For example, does BioLogos strive for dialogue? I forgot to put it here, but you'll find the sources in the description box. So why isn't there more species? If deep time evolution is true, the species argument fails because it's actually evidence for our model. And I wanted to point on another thing where, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you, brother, but I'm trying to find, we got a ton of papers here. When it comes to like retrotransposons, okay, ERVs, you know, they'll say that we've force-fitted all of this into our model. But here's the thing, we predict, it's on paper, that if design diversity is true, we would expect genome-wide functionality. And that also applies to these genetic elements that evolutionists assume are the result of ancient viral infections or evolutionary processes, which means we're looking at a genome that mostly comprises of evolutionary leftovers. No, so we're not force-fitting the data. We're actually confirming predictions that retroviral promoters in the human genome are active, essential, functional. Okay, a lot of these retrotransposons, these jumping genes, can move from site to site, inducing variation, right? If you're familiar with the variation-inducing genetic element hypothesis. So everything we're seeing in terms of genetics, okay, far from being junk DNA, the pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to influence genes and chromatin. And we're going to be having Dr. Joseph Kazil on again in a couple weeks for a highly technical lecture on junk DNA. Intronic ALUs influence alternative splicing. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in immune response. Here's another one, redundancy. We predict functional redundancy or functional variation. They predict neutral variation or redundancy that is not well designed. No, what we're actually seeing is good design, forward thinking. So we're not just adopting these evolutionary mechanisms because we have no choice. No, what we're seeing is confirmation of the design diversity hypothesis. Protein moonlighting. We got these proteins that can do multiple things like a multifunctional tool. Okay, DNA can be read both forwards and backwards. We have information compression into every nucleotide. It's fascinating, okay? Multiple overlapping codes. So point is, no, it's actually the evolutionists, Matt, that are force-fitting all of this data into their model. What we're predicting in terms of the genetics and the epigenome as it relates to variation, speciation, adaptation, we see is coming true more and more every day. Go ahead, brother. What are your thoughts?
Oh, of course. Hey, here's another one though. If you can go back to the video, but just leave it on pause so we can show people the visual chart that he had up. We don't have to hit play yet because I wanted to go over a couple of things, not too in detail because the list is pretty long, but at least just to show a couple of the things. You might maybe have to rewind for a minute. Sorry, I didn't realize it was that far into it. There was a list showing vestigial organs, beneficial mutations.
Oh, yeah.
It was more along the lines of that. I didn't realize we had already.
There we go.
Yeah. So when we're talking about vestigial organs, most of us believes that they're not vestigial. It just depends on the definition that you're going to use. You know, if it means lost primary function, remember the vestigial organ was considered the appendix for a very long time, but in every other primate, it's used to break down plant cellulose. With us, it never has done that. It never does do that. It's used as a backup immune system. It produces killer B cells like your thyroid produces killer T cells. Then we have the junk DNA paradigm, which actually is an intelligent design prediction that junk DNA sequences aren't random, but important genetic material. This is an old prediction as well. You can find that on Wired magazine going way back. And then we have genetic imperfections, but that's genetic entropy. That would go to our model. Same with even a vestigial organ. Wouldn't that be considered genetic entropy? That would be in line with what we would say. Then we have natural selection. We don't believe that natural selection builds anything. It just helps the adaptation process. And it does very, very little. It's almost like epigenetics. You can change your fur color. It can change your skin color. It can change a lot of these things based on where you're living, what's going on in your environment. But the increases are very minute as far as a genetic perspective is going on. Natural selection doesn't create this new information. The A, G, C, and T, those are the same. It's not creating more of them. It's just shuffling around the information. And then we have the gene duplication. But these are very, very rare events. And you can see that when you even read through their material and how rare they really are, extremely rare. And when we go through, most of them are damaging. They're like mutations. Most of them are harmful. So you can't take 99 steps backwards and then 1 forward and expect to get anywhere. But that's what they're expecting us to believe. And it's just, oh, here's some other problems with gene duplication. Horrible, horrible. The list goes on. But I mean, one other thing came to my mind, and that was, he said, we see evolution as evil. Evil. Well, if believing you came from pond scum by accident is evil, I don't know. Well, let's see. Does this cause people to commit suicide? Does it cause people to do school shootings? How about depression? Does it lead to a bad mindset? If the answer is yes to even any of those, then it's probably true that it is evil. Now, it's just a mindset. So evolution is a belief, and so is young Earth creation. But their beliefs have a different root. They go back to a different perspective. If one is accident, you're dead, you're gone, nothing matters. The other one has a good ending. So take it or leave it. So is it evil? Well, it just depends. It depends on the mindset. And it's because evolution doesn't have a very good outcome. It definitely doesn't have a good beginning and doesn't have a good end result. So therefore, would you categorize something like that? Well, making people kill each other themselves, yes, that would be considered evil. So is evolution, the process of it, evil? Is changing of alleles evil? No. Without adaptation, we would die. God designed us to adapt. So it's not evil because he created it. So no, it's not evil. But what they've extrapolated back is the pagan version of evolution. And that is very bad. Yes. So let's play some video. My bad. Go back to where we were.
No, that's good, brother. Whatever you got to say, brother. Let me just one. Yeah, even looking at this list, right? I mean, natural selection we covered, fine tuning, descent with modification. The descent is obviously assumed. Yeah, this is definitely an odd list. When we said jumping genes, these classes of retrotransposons, endogenous retroviruses. I mean, I just went over a dozen papers showing how functional and essential these DNA elements are. That's why the question has always been, are these really the ancient remnants of viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? We've got two predictions. One prediction from the evolution side that assumes evolution. To prove evolution, they assume the origin of all genetic variation and the origin of all these retroviral-like elements are essentially through evolutionary processes, mutations, viral infections, okay? Pseudogenes, they'd assume these are genetic mistakes. Therefore, when they find pseudogenes between humans and chimps, they assume these have been inherited from the common ancestor. All these assumptions, right, that go into their descent with modification story. But the creation model, we assume treasure, we don't assume junk, and that's why we have predictions that these hierarchies are there by design, and that's exactly what we're finding. We find that a lot of these DNA elements also contribute to variation. So like I said earlier, what we're seeing is actually the evolutionists that are not tapping out, and they're saying, well, you know, these endogenous retroviral-like functions were co-opted, but then we ask over and over again for empirical evidence for this, or a technical paper showing non-functional endogenous retroviruses going from non-functional to functional, and they admit they don't have them. Okay, genetic drift. I mean, genetic drift's a problem for them. These nearly neutral mutations that are mostly deleterious are then subject, because they're invisible to natural selection, they're subject to genetic drift. Okay, so all these things are on the side of the creationists. Okay, these deleterious mutations, low impact deleterious mutations accumulate, subject to genetic drift, they degenerate. Okay, so what they look to as the originator of variation, mutations, we actually see are damaging. They degenerate information systems. They're functionally compromising to organisms. That's why the design diversity hypothesis makes the most sense, both theologically and scientifically. Did God say be fruitful and clone yourselves? No, he said be fruitful and multiply. That's why the starting point of design diversity, where God front loads Adam and Eve and the original biblical kinds with pre-existing heterozygosity makes the most sense of the data, and this is confirmed by the scientific evidence. So it's really fascinating stuff. It is. Okay, so let's see where we were, brother. I think we were, yeah, right around here. There we go. I'm going to reshare because I want to make sure the audio is clicked on. And Christopher Silvius, I appreciate it, brother. Long live the king. Amen. Amen. So here we go. Jamie Russell, I appreciate the support. We got a great chat. We're going on 2.5 hours. We still got over 50 people in the chat. So glad you are all here. I appreciate it. I hope we've gotten to most of the questions. We like to make this interactive, but here we go.
To really the more important topic, the theological impacts of this work. One of the key points of rhetoric for the young Earth creationists is that the creation model preserves biblical orthodoxy, right? That is the thing that people hang their hat on. It's helping me preserve orthodoxy, but does it? Although we have serious issues with the science of young Earth creationism, our biggest issue is with the theological impacts of this burgeoning new form of young Earth evolutionism. We submit that some of the new views represent a steady migration away from biblical orthodoxy, even if they don't recognize that themselves. I'm going to try to provide 6 examples to support our concern. All right, example 1, concerning the biblical kind, since that's where I began. Consider the intention of Genesis 1. It is written in the midst of nations who believe that nature is chaotic, with natural processes serving at the whim of capricious and narcissistic gods. If it so amused the gods, a fish might give birth to a whale, or a sheep to a goat. Not so, says Genesis 1. Nature reflects its author. It is orderly and structured. But within the human experience, we might add within the human experience, and we might add within the scope of biblical chronology, cows only give birth to cows, giraffes to giraffes, and sheep to sheep. The young Earth model overturns this assurance with suggestions that Adam and Noah didn't even know what a sheep or goat looked like. All there was an original bovid, or in some cases, maybe just an original ruminant. And giraffes didn't even exist in the garden or before the flood, and have only recently been derived. A subpoint to this also is that biblical animals are familiar in the Bible and geographically consistent with our world. There's over 100 animals that we can find listed in the Bible. Some of these are have such details that we can identify what species they are. They're the same species that we know and understand today. How could such incredible changes be taking place within the scope of recorded human history, and there be no mention in Scripture of this vast, rapid speciation happening? What about references to animals that we know that don't exist today, or that live in other lands? Geographically, the Bible animals are the animals we understand to be in the locations that they are today. So within the scope of understanding of history, within human history, they remain similar.
Okay, that was pretty good. That was a good amount of stuff. I had in my notes talking about how he must have said something about genetic variation should be running out over time. I don't want to go backwards, so we're just going to move on. I guess I can talk about that later. But one thing that was mentioned was the young Earth creationist supposedly preserves biblical orthodoxy, right? He says again that Adam didn't even know what a modern day species was. So therefore, identifying what a kind is basically impossible. He never knew what a giraffe was. So let me defend that. Let's say I believe that Adam actually did know what a giraffe was. Remember I said I was going to go to linguistics. So let's do that. I should have got ready for this. I'm sorry. I had something I wanted to overlay so that you can see. There we go. As that loads, we're going to talk about the word giraffe because it's a strange looking animal. And if Adam would have named it something, wouldn't it have been named after probably what it looked like? And wouldn't that have been inherited down? Would all nations have followed the trend? If they would, some places actually call it by something else, or would they have changed the name? Well, let's find out. So the giraffe is a strange looking animal, and if we track it back to its given etymology, we can follow it right back to why Adam named it as something very strange himself. The French giraffe and the Italian giraffa are said to be a corruption of the earlier Arabic ziraf. Although the term is meaningless in Arabic, we can still go even further back and find where they got the word from, and using etymology and transliteration rather than etymology and translation, one will discover that ziraf, or zirafa, there's an H at the end, I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced, is the ancient Hebrew word for zafar, meaning neck, while Adam, or any ancient human, would have actually called the creature they were looking at a giraffa, meaning a necked creature. The Hebrew word for this part of the anatomy is called oref, or more perfectly pronounced giraffe. Now we've got a perfect sound and the sense for giraffe, since goref means the scruff of the neck, like a scarf or a scruff, which are the neck-focused words with the initial S. But that's non-historic because that was added later by the Romans. But etymologists don't have to dig very far to get the true origin of a word, but they refuse to consider Hebrew because obviously they reject the biblical starting point. But what I'm getting at is that if you follow and you trace a word back that everybody seems to use and pronounce in a little bit different of a way, you find that the actual name of the creature they're looking at has to deal with the neck, probably because of the length of its neck, obviously. But if evolution were true and this creature didn't even live in these regions of the world where people would have seen these creatures, how could Adam have named a creature he never saw that lived in an entirely different place in the world at an entirely different time? Because the animal obviously didn't exist where he lived. But yet that's exactly what we see when we look at the oldest language on earth, going back to Paleo-Hebrew, which is right next to Sanskrit back in the time. So what are the odds of that? I want you to guys, I would just ponder that sometime. Think about that. That is fascinating. That's linguistic powers, right? Because if Adam was going to do anything, if we were going to be able to find out what is a kind, what did Adam look at? And if we can't go to the fossil record and pick exactly what species there was, right? Because we can't look at all the different dogs and go, what was the first dog species to form? We can't really do that by looking at fossils. There's all assumption that's left. But if we can go to the root words of history, we might be able to do it linguistically. So you're up. I'll go next.
Oh, great stuff. Great stuff. I'm going to share a screen here on something that I had from, let's see. As you know, we've got a ton of slides and images. So right here. Modern species in the Bible. Okay, Dr. Jensen has pointed this out in a series of articles that I highly recommend, and please check out the technical papers that are referenced in these articles as well as in the description box of this video, okay? In this objection, Duff acts as if the appearance of one species in a min implies that all descendants of the mean, Baramine, must have therefore formed as well. Instead, as I detailed in a technical paper, okay, and this one is the natural selection, speciation clocks imply linear speciation rates within kinds. New species form in a temporal order, implying that some modern species split off Earth. See, what people don't understand when it comes to species is depending on the environment, depending on the need versus the non-need to change, you can have a large population where you have subpopulations that migrate or branch off early, and then for whatever reason, shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, inbreeding, okay, isolation, they can start developing differences. Okay, now remember, this is all horizontal changes, not vertical changes, right? You're not going to take a single-celled-like ancestor into a whale from constant shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. No, you need the development of novelty, okay? We're saying the novelty is already there, and there have been changes since that original novelty, okay? But you can still have that large population, that original population that are still going about in their environment. So there's not always, so that's why we see in the fossil record a lot of the times is stasis, where there's not necessarily a need for change. Okay, and that's why if you actually go through Dr. Jensen's highly technical paper on this, where he puts forth many testable predictions, then you'll see that new species form in a temporal order, implying that some modern species split off early from the mean ancestor while others split off late. Okay, so you can have some species or populations splitting off early, and then as time goes on, other populations splitting off a little later. Okay, this is all empirical as well. It's not like it's hard to believe or anything. In other words, the early appearance of some, okay, and we hear this all the time. I mean, Dan Cardinal, Dodgeball Dan, made some claims about this too, that this is a problem. In other words, the early appearance of some modern species is exactly what my model predicts. So you see how they're going to these arguments, even though these are arguments that have already been dealt with and predicted. So yeah, when we see some early or some modern species of felids, okay, that we see today early on, in hieroglyphics or also modern species mentioned in the Bible, this is exactly what we'd expect, just due to the nature of speciation events. Furthermore, in this same technical paper, as well as in the lay literature, I have already rebutted his points. And from my understanding, I don't think Joel Duff, and he seems like a nice guy. I mean, we're just dealing with his arguments. Seems like a nice enough guy, but I'd like to know if he's actually responded to Jensen's rebuttals to his arguments, because we want to further the debate. We want to further this dialogue without having to constantly refute straw man arguments and repeated talking points. Again, since he fails to interact with either of these sources of the young Earth creation information, he supplies no evidence that he's even aware that these bodies of written material exist. Now, we know people like Inspiring Philosophy and Sentinel Apologetics, they, of course, have not looked into this, but somebody like Joel Duff may have. Now, I want to point this out, too, okay? There's another slide here I want to... Okay, this whole fossils argument and looking to fossils over, say, genetics to determine ancestry. Well, I pointed this out in my recent debate with Marshall, okay? And we've had Dr. Rob Stadler on many times, and I highly recommend his book, The Scientific Approach to Evolution. But in his book, he points out, and I got to go over this because it really is just a death blow to their assumptions behind labeling certain fossils as different species, okay? Because remember, nobody cares or remembers the guy who found the 10th Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil. No, they remember the guy who found the first. They remember the guy who found the first Stegosaurus fossil, okay? So any little morphological variation that we see in the fossil record, they want to label a different species, right? So one of the world's foremost paleontologists, Jack Horner, presented a brilliant TED Talk in November 2011 entitled, "Where Are the Baby Dinosaurs?" He presented numerous impressive dinosaur finds, each classified as a separate species and bearing the name selected by its discoverer. He then pondered why we never find baby versions of the named dinosaurs. By cutting into the skull bones and performing microscopic analysis of bone structure, he was able to estimate the maturity of each animal at death. Okay, this gets even better. As a result, many separate dinosaur species, notice this, many separate dinosaur species turned out to be different levels of maturity of the same dinosaur species. So because of how low quality and low confidence science looking at bones found in the dirt are, we've gotten separate dinosaur species from the same dinosaur species because it was not recognized that we're looking at different levels of maturity. I mean, if that's not low quality, low confidence science, I don't know what is. Infants, adolescents, and adults of the same dinosaur species had been incorrectly classified as separate species. We see so many of these types of examples in the fossil record. For example, we point out Lee Berger, famous paleoanthropologist, even admits that Australopithecus afarensis, which people may know as Lucy, is nothing more than a chimeric species, the mixture of bones from different species. Okay, we see this with Australopithecus sediba, habilis. Okay, this is just low quality science we're dealing with. We need to focus on the genetics to determine ancestry, and that's why the genetics confirm separate ancestry. Okay, and I like how Dr. Stadler finishes this off. So Horner explained that this occurs because scientists have egos. And scientists like to name things. This is Horner admitting this. In order to obtain fame in the discovery of a new species. This is a simple example of how bias can be a very powerful force whose influence can overwhelm the limited power of the tool of science in a field such as this. When addressing a hotly contested issue like evolution, the power of bias will be further amplified. If bias could lead paleontologists to adopting the fallacy that a single species was actually several separate fossilized species, then a similar bias could lead paleontologists to adopt a fallacy that several distinct life forms with no evolutionary linkage represent an evolutionary sequence of life forms. So, point is, we need to look to genetics. And when we do look to genetics, we're able to make testable predictions. These predictions are able to be tested. And as we're seeing now, oftentimes confirmed. Go ahead, Brother Matt.
No, I was just I like that. I was throwing up pictures here of studies that confirm exactly what you were saying. They admit right there, and you can see that there's no scientific consensus on the evolutionary role of the fossil apes. They're basically astounded that there's nothing compatible with what they've been saying this whole time. They looked around and they're like, this is a mess. This is a complete mess. I know in the textbooks they say it's clean, but it's not clean. They said it's a disaster. So if the experts admit that there's really nothing there but interpretation, then it's pretty funny that when they give you these textbooks and they say this is a fact, put the answer down right, and yet the experts are like, no, this isn't true. We don't know. It's just ironic to me that they're going with that as far as their argument goes. It's pretty bizarre to me. But that was just going off of what you said. Something that was peculiar about what Joel said was that animal geographically are consistent with our world today. Well, I don't really know what that means because, okay, let's take the Pangea-like continent, right? We would have a bear, and we would probably assume the bear on the right is what it was because that's the fossils we found. Nothing but a gigantic version of what's on the left. But yeah, we have brown bears, black bears, white bears. They live on every different continent on Earth, and their fur is different. What they eat might be different, but that's really about it. That's about it when it comes to bears. So we would expect a bear pre-flood to be very similar to a bear post-flood. And genetic variation should be running out over time. Well, that depends on what you mean. Are we talking about variation, or are we talking about diversity? Two different things. So you got to be careful when you listen to a comment like, how come we don't see variation running out over time? Well, what do you mean? Things are speciating, so variation is actually increasing. It's the genetic diversity that is based on mutations, and mutations are accumulating, so diversity is increasing. But what we're talking about is the shifts inside being what we would expect from something like inbreeding. That's what we're talking about with heterozygosity to homozygosity. So certain things are increasing. Yes, mutation accumulation is increasing. So therefore, diversity is going up. But is this diversity a good thing? Probably not. So
here's the question then, Matt. Do we believe in more evolution than the evolutionists, as the critics keep saying and asserting?
No, it's completely different. That's all.
It's opposite. It's almost opposite.
Yeah.
In light of everything we're saying, because the evolutionists need to build up the novelty. They need to build up the information. They need to build up through mutations the genetic variation and DNA differences to allow for genetic processes like recombination, gene conversion to even act upon. Okay. But when we start from design diversity, that which they say is novel, as in it had to have been added at some point in the evolutionary history of living organisms, it's already there. It's built in. Right. So just like you said, in shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity or recombination or gene conversion in one single generation, we have new varieties. And those new varieties come about quickly because those DNA variants that have been shuffled up are already there. They were created. And it makes more sense because when we see mutations, we don't see them adding useful variation. We see them adding negative variation. And this has all been confirmed through numerous technical papers demonstrating that organisms go downhill. They degenerate due to mutation accumulation. And there have been all different types of parameters set in these numerical simulations. And regardless, your best case scenario is natural selection can slow down the degeneration process, but it can't stop it, right? But really, the fatal blow to their position is the fact that if what they're saying is true, then we should find that the vast majority of genetic sequences and genetic elements are junk, useless, and the result of evolutionary leftovers. And yet we do not find that. If they want to say the vast majority of activity in the genome, right? Because we've made testable predictions. Jensen points this out, that genetic knockout experiments is going to be the best way to determine what is and what isn't functional. Obviously, for ethical reasons, this has not been done on humans, thank God. Okay. But the point is, it's premature to say that the vast majority of our genome is junk. But since we know that the vast majority is at least active, to say that that activity is just spurious, right? They'll oftentimes look to spurious transcription. That's to say that natural selection was incapable, according to deep time evolution, to remove the junk. That junk would be wasteful of energy and resources for the cell. So no, it makes sense that that activity, over 80% activity, is there for a reason. And that's why we're, as young Earth creationists, able to make predictions on genetic knockout tests or third position codon variation on these genetic elements like endogenous retroviruses, or you snip out this DNA sequence might result in this disease, and so on and so forth. Okay. Yeah. What are your thoughts, brother? Did you want me to continue here?
Sure. I just was going to say one more thing about the
Sure.
genetic variation that should be running out over time. That also very much depends. Can something actually speciate? That helps it survive a little bit. Remember, bears don't do it very often, right? So what should we see? Should we see bears with less with the genetic variation going down? We actually do. We know that polar bears are more of a recent bear species. They're white. They live in the Arctic, and they're highly degenerate. They are a mess genetically, and their genetic variation is completely running out. A speciation event would only help them, but we've yet to see one. Because
let me ask you a question, actually. Sorry, because at least Joel Duff, and I appreciate it, in the chat said, chat's flying by, so I'm missing it. Hyperspeciation might be a better term, because I asked if he still believes we believe in hyperevolution, because that's typically what you hear from them is hyperevolution. So I appreciate him saying, well, maybe hyperspeciation. But here's the thing, Matt, and this just came to mind. Is hyperspeciation even appropriate? Because doesn't hyperspeciation imply that speciation is necessarily slow? As in, doesn't that assume what evolutionists have always said about speciation? But since we now recognize that speciation events can happen quickly, as in it's not exactly true to what has always been assumed, what are your thoughts? Is it really accurate to say this is just hyperevolution, like this is just beyond the norm, or I mean hyperspeciation? What do you think, brother?
It also comes down to the fact that the term speciation is used so loosely. How can we agree to speciation when we disagree with the definition of it? If we go by the general term of speciation, then therefore a lion and a tiger are a different species, but yet they can breed and make offspring. So therefore they're not a new species. So you see, it's very convoluted. Do we believe that something can become very diverse very quickly? Yes, we're going to get into that, because he shows some pictures in Egypt and he said that shouldn't exist on a young Earth creationist timescale, but I'll show why I believe it can. So again, it comes down to the definition and how fast we see mutations accumulating, and then how fast diversity actually increases. Especially, we've never taken an animal and watched something get released into the wild where it has the entire world it can go to watch how fast it can diversify and spread. Can you imagine an entire world with animals like all birds being released all at the same time, where they can now diverse in the entire world? I mean, they've got snow now, they've got desert,
look at this.
They've got tropics.
So we constantly look to this massive control system, right? So we got the epigenome, right? Above and beyond, we have this extra layer of additional information that helps control. If every single gene, as we point out, Matt, was turned on at the same time, that would be bad. That would lead to disease. So we have this control mechanism that determines when genes can be turned on and turned off. And we see here's a paper I highly recommend reading. Epigenetic variation may contribute to the phenotypic diversity of Darwin's finch populations that cannot be detected through genomic studies. So point is, we can see just through epigenetic regulation and we have millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on via environmental cue or change. So this is all evidence for forward thinking. I mean, natural selection sees the short term, right? Natural selection isn't worried about me getting cancer in 50 years. It's worried about me surviving till tomorrow. Same thing with species. It sees the short term. But what we see here is long-term thinking processes in the genome, right? Because epigenetics requires long-term thinking. So if evolutionists want to apply a mind to their mechanisms, then in a way they're admitting to what we're saying is that forward thinker, right? These forward thinking mechanisms go back to a forward thinker. So if you go here, I mean, paper after paper, as we point out, is rapid evolution common in introduced plant species. Animals are evolving faster than you think. I mean, none of these are creationist sources.
Right.
Rapid evolution has been recorded in some plants and fish. A lot of this, look at this. More and more evidence is showing that rapid evolution can occur in as little as 10 to 100 years. So, yeah, point is, I mean, we're just, what we are talking about and what we are saying is consistent with our model. We are seeing in the secular literature. And it really is fascinating. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
And you got to remember, we don't have words that exist that aren't, for example, evolution. So when something speciates, is that evolution? Well, we have to call it evolution. We don't have a young creationist term.
They hijack the term.
Yeah, exactly. So we're stuck with whatever is, first of all, we're stuck with whatever the population would know anyway. So even if we came up with our own new term, nobody would know what it was. It would have to spread first. It would have to become coined and really popular. And we just don't really care that much. And because the word evolution can be used to describe anything, we have to just define terms. That's all. That's what you have to do in your debates. You know how it is.
Right, exactly. If we're just looking at micro-evolutionary variation, right, then they hear the word evolution, right, micro-evolutionary variation, and they assume that type of large-scale evolution, but they have essentially hijacked the word. So they want to assume, just like when we say speciation, but when we say speciation, what we mean is changes, but due to shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. Well, for the evolution of higher life forms over time from a past universal common ancestor, you need the addition of genetic information, meaningful genetic information. You need essentially vertical changes, not just horizontal or downhill changes.
Right.
Or mutations which are functionally comparable. Even your best beneficial mutations. The Lenski paper or the Lenski research discovered that the rate of beneficial mutations is about 1 in a million. And even when you get that 1 in a million, it's typically reductive, still functionally compromising. So you're not going to take a fish to fisherman that way, is my point. But I know you had some more visuals and arguments you wanted to show pertaining to the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Did you want me to play a little bit more?
Not even to that part in the video yet. So yeah, we got to keep moving.
Okay. Yeah. It's just like the last video we did on, because we're going on 3 hours. What did we do? What was the last one? It was, we did Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal, right, on the genetic boundary study. I mean, yeah. We went to we like to leave no stone unturned, right? So,
oh no, look, you're only halfway through.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to turn down my volume.
Okay.
We also can see from contemporary art as well that images from early art show the same animals, even the same variety of animals that we understand today and know today. Example number 2. Younger creationists, for younger evolutionists, a prohibition on increases in genetic information is imposed on scripture, not drawn from it. The basic idea, or young Earth idea, is that creation presented a perfect genetic code, right? One that can't be improved. Therefore, any changes to the genetic code after sin must represent losses, not gains of information. But we might ask, where do we find such information in the scripture? Where are we told that this is true? Consider examples from the Bible, right? We know that some types of information have increased over time. Consider the knowledge gained by Adam and Eve upon eating the fruit. Well, we might not consider that the most positive example of increased information, yet it is a change. We also see God has given us his word, right, since the fall. That's an increase in information. How do we know that God has not allowed information in the sense of genetic information to increase over time? It appears that opposition to increases in genetic information is forced upon scriptures, not derived from it. Now, maybe it can't be gained, but we shouldn't exclude the possibility before ever looking for it. Example number 3. The young Earth view says that the initial created kinds were herbivores. Carnivory didn't enter the world until sin. So consider these creatures for a moment. Each of them is an exquisitely designed creature. We're in awe of these kind of organisms. The claws, talons, fangs, all these various things. Consider also wonderful characteristics that we often are amazed by as well. Here's a bird's nest down in the lower right-hand corner. It's adapted to blend into the ground surface for only one purpose, to hide from predation. So the logic here is God made herbivores during 6 days. Then he was done creating. Sin is responsible for carnivory and predation in a way. Therefore, sin is a creative force producing incredibly well-adapted and beautiful creatures, a creature on par a creator really almost on par with God. That the things that we see and marvel at in creation are things that are results of sin. And what is the mechanism of that? Younger Christians, we look to natural mechanisms to explain these things.
All right. Would you mind rewinding that back to the original picture of the Egyptian and different places in the world? And then we'll go from there. Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, full screen that for people. And then we will we'll go down the list. You took it off actually. But so at 14 minutes and 52 seconds, he said there's no mention of speciation in the Bible. Now, I don't know why there would be. First of all, that's a modern day scientific term. It didn't even exist. So and it's not a science textbook, so it really doesn't matter. That's not anything that would have been important to even put there. So that's probably why that's not there. Now, okay, I want you to notice, basically looking at that picture, that every one of those animals mentioned are post-flood, with the exception of the ox and some birds. But why is that? Why not mention animals that do not exist today? Well, there are. Have we seen a Leviathan or a behemoth? I don't know. I don't think so. And if we have, well, not today we haven't, but somebody in the past has. They drew them in artwork. So somebody got to see them, but not today, not alive today. So let's begin our journey with the images in the upper right-hand corner from Egypt. So yes, we do not believe in evolution where one species replaces another. We actually believe that all species can exist at the same time. So yes, we can see a house cat, and then below that we can see a lion. There's no problem with that. But if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you can see some type of a small cat species. This image is vague, but I see a lot when I look at it. This is in Egyptian history. Now, they only mention cats a very few times in the first kingdom of Egypt, and they are never domesticated. So therefore, it was only in the Middle Kingdom where cats get mentioned constantly in the daily life of the Egyptians. Therefore, if this picture, it was made in the first kingdom, there's only two choices. But it's probably not the actual first kingdom, because if you notice the cat standing on something that they painted as royal blue, and the color only existed as royal blue in paintings in the Middle Kingdom, which was 250 BC, which they used to paint, then they were either depicting a wild African cat called F. sylvestris or the Felis chatus. These are the two wild cats that were alive in the first kingdom. So it was those two the Egyptians bred together to create the modern day house cat. In their time, it was called the Felis sylvestris libica, or the Manu house cat. It was the first ever domesticated cat, and they used it to kill the rodents. So this picture is either in the middle or the late kingdom. There's no way it could have been first. This shows us that there was plenty of times for humans to come across these wild species of small cats, because there were only two that existed, and breed them to make the house cat. Because you got to remember, this is a long time after the flood. And how do I know that? Because if we look at a modern day study, and if you read that, by putting those things together, we see that this show right here is there's 170 cats that were in the exhibit. More than half of these breeds were recognized as existing in less than 50 years. So that means that 85 new cat breeds were born into existence in just 50 years. So literally 1 generation of humans can produce more cat breeds than existed in all of nature by just manipulating their breeding. I want you to think about that. Now, on the bottom left, you see what is a mouflon sheep. Now, this is the sheep that was on the ark. And how do we know that? Because it has the highest amount of heterozygosity, and all modern day sheep descend from that one right there. So there's no reason that shouldn't be in the picture anyway, because we would expect to find that one there. So now there's a lion in the bottom right. Now, the lion in the Egyptian carvings goes only as far back as Ramses II and Tutankhamun, who were the first to both illustrate sitting with a lion or having a lion sitting next to them. Tutankhamun lived in 132 BC, and Ramses lived Second, in 1279 BC. This is literally 2,000 years after the flood happened. So of course there would be enough time for the 8 cat species that we have to form worldwide. I believe that it would be crazy to not think that you would get a lot of variety of different cats, having the entire world diversifying from the single cat that got off of the ark and speciated to the different cats that we see today. And we know they're all genetically related because, as I said earlier, you can take a lion and a tiger and breed them and they can get a liger. You can take a house cat, well, it might not be physically possible with a lion and a house cat. I wouldn't want to watch it. And you're going to get some crazy variety of a species because they are all related. At least it can happen in vitro. You can still do that with all of them. That doesn't happen with humans and apes. You can't do that with any human and ape. It doesn't work. It's destroyed. The egg is destroyed almost immediately. So that's another way we can help determine what is a kind, because they're able to breed still, even to this day. Of course, there will be physical incapabilities with different kinds, but that's just what you're going to have. Then we see some birds in the bottom middle and an ox in the upper left-hand corner that the Egyptians were using. Bird species occur rapidly. We don't really know what we're looking at here. I'm not an expert, and I don't even know if the person was drawing something that was accurate anyway. He could have just been drawing a bird that he saw or from his imagination. So we're not really going to play with too many bird species because it's just too much, there's too much speculation going on there. But the ox, now that's a good one. Ox are like most cattle species, where mankind can manipulate them through breeding, and we breed them to what works best, what makes them safe, what has their more meat on their bones, how they can work and to till the land the best. So selective breeding happens, and it can be very, very fast. So because the Egyptians came across some kind of a wild cattle breed and either formed the ox or the ox was already on the ark, we just really don't know. It's some kind of an animal that gets bred very, very quickly. And anytime humans get around an animal where we start breeding it, we can manipulate genetics very, very quickly and very, very rapidly. And oxens are just one of those creatures. So at 1557 in the video, it says so the Bible says that Adam was not created and that man came from something else already living. I don't know if that's his perspective, but if it's evolutionary, then I guess so. Or that birds did not come from fish, but rather fish came from birds via evolution. I don't know. That goes against the biblical teaching, but we have to think about the clear interpretation. And so if ours were true, what would we see? Well, we would. Oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, hey, that was awesome. That was a fantastic rebuttal there. And I wanted to real quick. There we go. Chat's flying. Yeah, we just hit the 3-hour mark. So this has been a ton of fun, brother. I know we've covered a ton of information, but we've maintained over 50 people the whole time. So real quick before you continue, brother, Alec Cox, thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate the support, of course. As Matt knows, we're also working on a couple more books to add to the collection that you can see behind me. I've also got a few of our other books over to my right. So like I said, your amazing support allows us to continue doing this full time. So he says, irrefutable evidence at Standing for Truth that the scientists, so-called, are monkeying around with the actual results that do not fit their narrative of millions and billions of years. It's very dishonest, all for money. So I would say that I'm definitely kind of fascinated, Matt, and we did a few videos recently debunking Simon Dan, stated clearly on ERVs, and then a couple of weeks ago on Dan Stern Cardinal. And I find that most critics are still stuck a couple of years ago using arguments like, as you know, we've been dealing with this argument that we ignore the phylogenetic rate and only look at the pedigree rate. But we're so beyond that. And what I mean is that we've already got technical papers coming out of the young Earth creation side showing confirmation that these DNA differences in the mitochondrial DNA compartment in the Y chromosome are actually reflective of just thousands of years, because we're able to read the history of civilization from these DNA compartments, these phylogenetic trees. So I just find that they really are out of date, or they don't have we realize this with Dr. Robert Carter's brilliant article refuting Dodgeball Dan and Erica, that regardless of how many times they are corrected, they're still going to repeat their talking points. So that being said, thank you, Brother Alec and Matt. Is there a timestamp you want me to skip to, brother?
Well, he was already in it. He was talking about carnivory. Did we get past that, or was he still on it? I wasn't sure, because I know that he said perdition was a good thing because it was produced by sin. That was an interesting comment. Sin is a creator. I would say
The animals that we know today.
Go ahead.
Example number.
Yeah, skip forward.
Can you hear? So I think it was right around here that he said that.
Yeah, let it play for a bit. We'll repeat it. It's okay.
Where do we find such information in the scripture? Where are we told that this is true? Consider examples from the Bible. Right? We know that some types of information have increased over time. Consider the knowledge gained by Adam and Eve on eating the fruit. Well, we might not consider that the most positive example of increased information. Yet it is a change. We also see God has given us his word, right, since the fall. That's an increase in information. How do we know that God has not allowed information in the sense of genetic information to increase over time? It appears that opposition to increases in genetic information is forced upon scriptures, not derived from it. Now, maybe it can't be gained, but we shouldn't exclude the possibility before ever looking for it. Example number 3. The younger view says that the initial created kinds were herbivores. Carnivory didn't exist in the world until sin. So consider these creatures for a moment. Each of them is an exquisitely designed creature. We're in awe of these kind of organisms. The claws, talons, fangs, all these various things. Consider also wonderful characteristics that we often are amazed by as well. Here's a bird's nest down in the lower right-hand corner. It's adapted to blend into the ground surface for only one purpose.
Stop here.
Predation. So the logic here is God made herbivores during 6 days. Then he was done creating. Sin is responsible for carnivory and predation in
Go ahead, brother.
Okay, yeah, so you notice they'll say that carnivory was a creator. I'm sorry, sin was a creator because it created carnivore. I would refute that with the fact that obligate carnivores even today can still subside on plants and do fine. Obviously, they might not choose it because, the fall made things corrupt. And if it was natural, then in the next world, we would probably see the same carnivorous outcome. And we just won't, because we can already see Isaiah prophesied that the wolf will lay next to the lion in the next life. So if we don't see it in the next life and it's a replication of the world before, then what else could it possibly be? And when I said that we see carnivory as not the only way for carnivores to subside and exist, we can see that with lions. Here's one that lived its entire life rejecting meat, and it would lay next to the lambs and the donkeys and the horses and just do fine. It was never a tyrant. It was never evil. We have examples of a shark. This one got hooked and got hurt and injured, and all it chose to eat was plants. And that's an interesting one. So it was swimming around the aquarium, eating the turtle food, not its own. And that's interesting because that's a shark. You don't get more predatory than a shark. And yet here it is. And matter of fact, here's a video of a great white choosing plants over meat.
My crew throws in the bait to begin the test. First tuna, squid, and kelp.
Okay, the 3 baits are in. Whoa! She just took a small bite out of the kelp. She's coming back around. Wow, it went for the kelp again.
I'm sorry, everybody. I didn't realize when I hit play, my mic automatically went on mute. So I was explaining that the World War II in Europe, the zoos ran out of money and all they could feed the animals were cabbage. And so everything got cabbage, everything that was there, and they lived just fine. And then I was showing the great white. As you can see there at the end, it shows the kelp over anything else. And that's a wild great white, huge, massive shark. So obviously they can eat plants.
The shark ignored the tuna and the squid and took the kelp.
It's not a big deal for them. the longest living dog and went into the Guinness Book of World Records. It only ate plants. It was on a vegan diet. It did fine, obviously. If it's Guinness Book of World Records, it more than did just fine. We have snakes that literally chose to eat seaweed on the shores. We have a Komodo dragon, a notorious flesh eater. Why? Because their saliva has poison in it. But yet this variety in the Philippines chooses plants now. And it's very much like the Italian wall lizard, where they have an organ called a cecal valve that comes out when it eats plants and vanishes when it eats insects or meat, because it doesn't need it. So it needs to harbor more bacteria in its gut when it eats plants, and it does just that. That's amazing. We have crocodiles that are raised on a plant diet. And the reason they are is because it's probably much cheaper. But there's an alligator and a crocodile farm where they feed them only plants. Very peculiar in an evolutionary worldview, I would think, because it pretty much contradicts what one would expect to find. And we also have, here's dolphins. Here's another lion that chose nothing but plants. Very, very fascinating. That one lived on spaghetti. It likes spaghetti. Its owner fed it spaghetti most of its life. That's an interesting choice for a lion. I can't even imagine how much spaghetti it probably had to eat. And here's an interesting article. So rather than concluding that dinosaurs were vegetarian and became meat eaters, they said that dinosaurs became vegetarian. So I would say rather than went, I would change that right there to changed from vegetarian. So that would be my take on it. Now that's interesting because these are theropods, right? These are Tyrannosaurus rex. These are velociraptors. And they went to the fossil record and they go, well, let's see what the carnivores are eating. Let's see what was going on. And they found that the majority actually ate plants. There's a carnivore died eating a yucca leaf. That's a yucca plant in its mouth. So what's going on here? These are completely contradictory to evolutionary theory. Now, did they have to live their entire lives on plants? Is that what had to happen? I'm not saying it is. The reason why is because we don't know how long Adam lived before sin entered the world. Animals didn't have to literally live on plants their entire existence. They just had to do it for a very short time because God knew that sin would enter the world and that everything was going to turn on each other. So you can't have a world with only plant-eating animals, or else everything is just going to get population out of control. There needs to be balance. And God knew that there was going to be a fall. There's no doubt about it. And so otherwise he wouldn't have given the devil, the master deceiver, to earth to us if he didn't know we were gonna fall. This was a planned thing. So of course carnivores were created, and then they just ate plants until the fall happened. That was it. So it doesn't seem like a very hard stretch to imagine that carnivores had to eat plants, especially when we have all these living examples of carnivores able to eat plants and live. Obviously a topic that I like a lot because I'm fascinated by diet, and it's astonishing to me that animals still have so much built-in capacity. See, we as humans don't do that. We were built very different than animals. We can't walk around and eat plants. We were designed to create and go up to the fruit of the trees and eat from that alone. We were frugivores. So when we eat other fruit groups, we must cook them. We can't go outside and start eating a plant. We'll probably die. We'll get very, very sick from it. We have to cook it to be able to process it. Animals don't have that problem.
I gotta say, brother, that was a ton of great information, and I learned a lot there. So even if I wanted to, a lot of times I like to play devil's advocate and be like, well, what about this? Well, what about that? You know, Matt, because we like to leave no stone unturned. I don't even know how I would, as an evolutionist, how I would debunk that. So as we've heard from Sentinel Apologetics, right, because he can't deal with the science and he strawmans and misrepresents, what I have heard him say with Inspiring Philosophy is, so you Raw Matt, as a young Earth creationist, you believe that Tyrannosaurus Rex was eating a watermelon in the Garden of Eden. How would you respond if they tried to mock you like that?
I would say absolutely not. God said that they ate plants. Plants are different. Think about what animals are supposed to do. They're designed to eat what's going on, so that God would have placed animals into a world that's completely green where there's foliage, so that animals would be able to eat the green. That would be their food source. Fruits, you can't. I mean, even if the watermelons were gigantic, Tyrannosaurus Rex wouldn't be getting the caloric intake. It was just walking around eating greens. It would go over to trees and it would just rip out the plants and survive from them. Just like a great white shark would be eating tons of kelp. You would imagine that the oceans would be full of kelp. Well, a great white shark obviously looks like it would be designed to kill and eat something, but without the fall, their nature wouldn't have changed yet, so they wouldn't have had that desire to fight among each other and get a taste for flesh. Because you got to remember, you could take a plant-eating animal and they will get a taste for blood and they'll want more of it. So perdition is something that was evil that happened after the fall. And so, no, a Tyrannosaurus Rex never eating watermelon. It would have been eating the plants, just like in every other theropod dinosaur and a lot of other animals were eating. They were eating greens. They weren't walking around eating pumpkins and watermelons and coconuts. They're not frugivores. We were. So it's just a different diet.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that we don't believe that great white sharks were eating watermelons in the pre-flood world? Do you see the level of argumentation that are coming from these theistic evolutionists like uninspiring compromiser and sentinel apologetics? It's probably why you don't see them engage the science very often, right? Because they hope that in their echo chambers on their channels they can straw man and misrepresent and actually maintain an audience that is ignorant enough to believe that what they're saying is accurate or true.
Right.
What would be more difficult, Matt? Going from a plant-eating dinosaur to a meat-eating dinosaur, or going from a single-celled like organism to a dinosaur? Because that's what they believe. And it's so fascinating based on what we now know about epigenetics and epigenetic regulation and these control systems, these forward-thinking mechanisms in our genetic code. It's almost like, as you were pointing out, God foreknew what would happen after the fall and front-loaded these types of defense mechanisms that could come about through environmental change. Isn't that right, brother?
Oh, of course. Of course. People are... they're always trying to find little holes here and there. Like, well, if God created carnivores, then obviously death existed, right? It's kind of like, well, let's look at it from a different perspective. Okay. God created vultures as well. And the Tyrannosaurus Rex. What did those creatures do? They were scavengers. They ate the dead. So their purpose wasn't fulfilled until something died. So how these creatures were created and they were able to subside on plants. We have vegetarian vultures today. Did you know that? There's literally a vegetarian vulture. It's completely white. It looks beautiful. It's very different than most vultures because most are just hideous. It's almost looks like an albino vulture. So we still have the original created kinds probably around. And like you said, it's much easier to transition over to be able to eat meat because all you need is hydrochloric acid level in the stomach, because the trypsin, which is the enzyme that's designed to break down meat, is found in raw meat. So you can literally pick up raw flesh and eat it, and it will have the enzymes to break itself down. All you need is enough hydrochloric acid to do it. But we risk doing that because of the high amounts of parasites and stuff that are in it.
So you're saying, because we'll often hear these theistic evolutionists say, or just your atheistic evolutionists say, that the amount of novel change that would need to occur to go from plant eating to meat eating is virtually impossible under the young Earth creation model. But you're saying it's not that difficult.
No, we can do it in a lab. They do it to mice. They want to see, like, what can happen. Let's change their diet. They did it to mice and they scared them to death epigenetically. They made mice love fruit. They'll go to it instantly. But what happened is they take these mice and they put them in a den and they put fruit in there. And every time they approached the fruit and they smelled it, they would shock them. And eventually they became afraid of even smelling the fruit. As a matter of fact, their offspring was scared of smelling fruit. So what happened? They started eating a different diet. Matter of fact, the Pottinger cat study was a great one. They found that when they changed the diet of the cats and started feeding them cooked meat, they genetically became compromised. Their bodies started to morph a little bit, and they were having stillborns, and there was all kinds of genetic problems. So they put them back on that diet because they didn't want to have genetic anomalies happen. But what happened is just that quickly, within just a couple generations, the Pottinger cat study actually showed it, so that morphology began to change that rapidly with saliva. The saliva wasn't as acidic as it normally would be, that you would need, because herbivores have more of an alkaline nature, because that's what's used to break down carbohydrates. You need amylase in the saliva, but carnivores don't have that. Carnivores have the ability to break down cholesterol at 100% efficiency. Herbivores don't really do that. So when you start feeding an herbivore more meat, it messes their system up a little bit. Same vice versa. There has to be a give and a take. So the changes start happening rapidly within the very lifetime of that creature, because it needs to survive. It needs to live, to reproduce, to be able to go on. And these epigenetic changes happen rapidly, and we can see it in experiments. So when they say, oh, it happens, it's too quick for you guys to happen here, it's like, what are you talking about? We see it live in experiments.
No, that's some great points. Here's a good question. I'm curious as to your thoughts. Joel Duff, and we appreciate your input, Joel. He's the one whose lecture we're reviewing, so it makes sense to put his question on screen. So he says, why would a T-Rex choose to eat grass and not a watermelon? Nothing in the Bible says they could not eat a watermelon. Hardly any caloric content in grass, much more in watermelon. What are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, I would imagine that it would probably enjoy watermelon, because if you think about what happens when you see here's a good one, for example. I will grab the image right now for you if I left it up. I probably did not. It's a picture that's in one of my books you can find, and it's wild wolves eating watermelon and bears doing the same thing. Watermelon's a great flavor, so if you throw it out there in nature, they're going to come to it. Of course, it would choose it, but usually you don't get enough of a crop where you can find sustainable amount of calories. You imagine things fighting over a watermelon field. All it would do is it would walk in there and it would eat every bit of it, kind of like a honey bear. Everything loves honey and everything loves salt. You put a salt lick out, all the animals come to get to the salt. They love it. But it's the one that's the biggest and strongest that wins the salt lick, or the watermelon field, or the honeycomb. So when a bear gets there, it rips the honeycomb down and it eats all the honey, and then it walks away. There's no honey left. So I would imagine if a T-Rex came across a watermelon field, it would just eat everything and there would be nothing left. And it's kind of like all avocados. Avocados only exist because of giant sloth. They loved avocados. They would swallow them whole, and they would walk around and they would excrement the seeds out, and they would plant more avocado seeds everywhere. But as anything else tried to come and eat the avocados, they couldn't get to them, because the sloth would just swat them out of the way and eat the entire tree as it walked by, because they were 7,000 pounds. So I would imagine the same thing with the T-Rex. Everything has a little bit of a favorite flavor, but they're uncontrollable. A horse or a dog, it'll eat till it dies. If you put the food out, it'll eat until it literally kills itself. So animals aren't that smart. They come across calories and they try to eat up as much as they can. And you got to remember, the pre-flood world was massive. It was mostly covered in green because it was tropical. And if you walk into any tropical forest that we see today, it's overrun by mostly tropical foliage, and fruit trees are more sparse. You don't find a lot. You don't come across like a whole Garden of Eden, for example. That was created specifically probably for Adam, and the animals were probably in a different location, because it mentions that rivers flowed from Eden, so it was probably on a plateau, and God brought the animals to him, and he probably took them away as well, because it's just he was. What are they going to do? Eat all of Adam's food? It wouldn't make much sense to leave him there. They probably got rid of him, because a brontosaurus would eat a whole lot of food compared to what Adam would be able to eat. So and what would the heirloom plants and fruits have been in the garden and the pre-flood world? Because a lot of what we see today, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert at this, is what we have created utilizing the more superior genetics of the heirloom plants and fruit, right? Yes. Yeah. And most of the heirloom stuff isn't very sweet. If you come across a banana in the wild, it tastes so bad you wouldn't eat it. But we hybridize them, And then all of a sudden, now we're able to get a very sweet tasting thing. And I would imagine watermelons are the same. Watermelons are sweet because we know when to water them and when to stop watering them and when to harvest them. Same thing with any fruit tree. Citrus was probably something that grew after the fall because most citrus have thorns on them. And we knew that after the fall, things started to grow thistles and thorns. So either citrus was there and the tree started to grow thorns on them, or they started growing after the fall. Regardless, citrus is one of those things that if you've ever walked up to a wild citrus tree like an orange or a lemon, they taste absolutely disgusting. Some of them have almost no flavor at all. But when you can monitor them like grapes and wine, you can stop watering them early and it concentrates the sugar to go into the plant, and now they taste good. So a wild watermelon might not even taste very good, but they would have just been walking around eating plants, not because of flavor, but because of caloric requirement. You know, a big beast growing really big. And if they can't get the calories, then it would have been fine as well, because you just wouldn't have grown very big. But we know in that world with massive amounts of oxygen and high amounts of magnetism, things grew big. You know, like look at dire wolves. They were massive. Look at beavers. They were hundreds and hundreds of pounds. A beaver then would give you a heart attack if it walked into your bedroom at night. I mean, that's massive. So, you know, they would have probably been able to thrive off of the plants because the plants would have been very plentiful. And I'm sure they would have had their favorite flavors, but it wouldn't have had to go on too long.
Great points all around, brother. You know, that's the problem, is they assume the present. We know the pre-flood world, which, as you're pointing out, was 90% green, right? 90% different than the world we live in today. And that's why we've got a whole video debunking the so-called heat problem, where we emphasize the fact that the pre-flood world was like the perfect battery to absorb most of that heat and use it to produce the oil, the coal, the natural gas we see today. So from our model is a ripple effect of beautiful answers to what the critics say are problems. Great points all around, brother. Did you want me to play some more of the video, or was there some more you wanted to address on that?
No, go ahead. I mean, I could come back to it.
Okay, here we go, guys.
In a way. Therefore, sin is a creative force, producing incredibly well-adapted and beautiful creatures. A creature on par, a creator really almost on par with God. That the things that we see and marvel at in creation are things that are the result of sin. And what is the mechanism of that? Younger creationists only look to natural mechanisms to explain these things. God has turned into evil. This is maybe one of the more familiar examples. We look at verses like heaven declaring the glory of God, we just heard earlier today. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are seen. Right? And the young lions roar for their prey. You open your hand. They're satisfied with good. But the young earth model says really the opposite. It says nature hasn't really declared the same message since creation. We have to divine our way to see the burning embers, I guess, of what's left of that good creation. Earth and cosmos declare the corruption of sin. And predation can't be good. But who are we to think that we can tell God what in nature is good and what isn't, especially when God has told us what is good? How can we go back against his word and use our words and our own idea of what perfection is above theirs? But I'd like to highlight, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to make sure I highlight this next one. I think it's a little less maybe well-known as an example of an issue here. And that is, this model is a God of limited power to preserve. Right? The biblical account of the flood tells us that God brought animals and birds of every kind to preserve life. But consider the young earth version now. Immediately, or soon after the flood, more than half of all the kinds went extinct. According to the numbers posted at the Ark Encounter, Noah's rescue failed for 55% of all kinds. Entire kinds. That means families of organisms that are gone. Our world only has less than half the diversity that God created initially in it. The world is running down in the young earth model. We started with tremendous diversity, and we're losing it all the time. And Noah's Ark did nothing really to help that. We simply lost half of it right after the flood. That's something that I think bears some thinking through, the importance of that. I'm just going to skip over the fine-tuning argument, because that's another thing that the philosophical argument that says that younger creationists are constantly bending the rules of nature, and therefore we're losing sort of a strong philosophical argument about the fine-tuning of nature, that God, the consistency of God is being lost through these new mechanisms that they're producing. But I'm going to move to questions for the church. All right, so these are things that I think are questions that emanate out of this information about what younger evolutionists are now preaching and teaching. We should be asking ourselves, are we willing to abandon the traditional biblical understanding of kinds? Are we ready to say that Adam and Noah didn't know what a sheep or a goat or even a giraffe was? That this world that he knew and saw was a radically different version of the world that we see today, and we can't relate to it at all? Who created the exquisitely designed predators and adapted prey after day 6? These are all questions we should be asking our younger creationist friends, getting them to think about these topics. and getting to have a biblical understanding of these things. Where are increases in information after Edom disallowed? What does it say about God's power? The power of God, if more than half of his kinds didn't need to have really bothered getting on the ark because they were going to walk off the ark and immediately go extinct. What does it mean that if most of the mechanisms of speciation young Earth creationists once mocked are now embraced in some form or fashion? And that they use really naturalistic mechanisms to try to explain all these things. So I want to say that most of these last items I've been mentioning are going to be further explored in Greg Davidson's forthcoming book, Friend of Science, Friend of Faith. And I've also brought copies of my polar bear test, which also explores further some of these divisions between creationists. I haven't really talked about progressive creationists rather than done a comparison, but my taxonomy of different forms of views of origins is explained in that. I've got copies up front. With that, I'll take some questions.
We made it through, brother. We did. It only took us 3.5 hours, but we did it.
Yeah.
I'm feeling pretty good about it. So yeah, what are your thoughts? I know there was a lot of points there. If you need me to share screen again on some of the questions or points that he asked and brought up, whatever you need.
Okay. Real quick, I just wanted to show a picture. I was going to show everybody of the wolves, what happened when they threw watermelons outside. The wolves chose the watermelons. So that was pretty cool. Okay, we got to think about like what was the intent of the ark, and did God really just destroy and wipe out the most diversity, and it wasn't really a preservative thing? Well, I would say that the ark was to replenish the earth. Is it replenished? If you look around, I say yes. It looks replenished to me. It looks like it worked. How about you guys? You guys can leave your comments below. Let me know what you think. Did we need dinosaurs? Do we need dinosaurs walking around? Clearly not. Is there a reason they were probably hunted to extinction, which we call dragons? These were deadly large creatures probably at this point, and they couldn't be tamed. So if you can't tame them, you can't use them, you can't eat them, you rid the world of them. That's pretty much where that would come from. Were they required for any necessary replenishment? I mean, clearly birds are. You need birds. Birds chirp, opens the stomata on the bottom of leaves to allow plants to breathe in oxygen in the morning. They eat the seeds and they fly around and they disperse the seeds. So we get plants everywhere because of birds. So clearly we do. How about beasts and insects? Well, they did just fine. These are good. Dinosaurs lived in a pre-flood tropical world, and they lived to be very huge, gigantic. And most of them ate vegetation, and they would require to because herbivores were huge. So what would happen to huge, gigantic herbivores in a world post-flood where plants don't grow this big? I mean, obviously they would require calories, and now they're not getting them anymore. So if the dinosaurs weren't killed out from people, the very environment itself killed them out, because it's okay. The Bible wasn't for dinosaurs. It's for mankind, right? So these types of creatures would have not been conducive to the environment, to us, to pretty much anything. I mean, they had their time. They were pretty much a violent mess from what we can tell. Their main food supply would now be gone, and a miniature version exists. So if you've got a triceratops and it weighs 14,000 pounds and it's walking around where there's only grass to eat, I would imagine that it probably wouldn't do so well for very long after the flood, just based on the caloric requirement for that kind of a creature anyway. So what I'm gathering is that these guys actually believe that because many species of the same kind died, therefore they were not preserved and God failed. Again, I would see this as a failure to see the bigger picture of what the ark was actually for. One, it was to preserve humanity, and anyone who was willing to trust in God and get on the ark, even without believing that there was a flood imminent. That's what the ark was for. That's what it was created for. It was created for Noah to tell the world, get on here. There's a flood coming. It's imminent. That was the number one reason. Two, it was to preserve the seeds. That's why Noah first gathered the seeds and the plants so that they could be replenished, tree seeds and grains. Then three, it was to preserve life that would help to replenish and restart the earth after it. Birds sow the seeds through migration. Livestock, they eat the grass, which helps to maintain the topsoil. It helps to promote biodiversity and reducing the spread of wildfires. It's helping produce natural fertilizer from them just walking around and protecting other wildlife habitats that are now forming. Nothing about the ark was to save one specific variety of a species, like a trilobite or a specific variety of dinosaurs, until modern day. So of course things can die out because it was humanity that was supposed to live on, and we were supposed to replenish the earth with foods that we could eat. And we did. Noah brought seeds. We have a lot of fruit trees, and the animals that survive today, we can see them walking around. These are the livestock. These were brought on for mankind. Now they exist, and they are not even for eating or for plowing the fields or for producing milk. You can find them. You can go to New Zealand and they'll be walking in the mountain regions. So clearly they replenish the earth, and they're a good thing. And just because a couple varieties didn't survive, or let's even say half didn't survive, the ark did its job. And when we look around the world, we can see that it did. I can go on. What does it say about God's power of half the animals were on the ark? Well, you know, I would say that it did exactly as it was intended to do. And we can see that just looking around. Past mechanisms that are now, that's going back. Sorry.
I don't want to stop you, brother. You're on a roll. You're on a roll.
Well, we stopped it a little early because if you were actually going to play one more minute, he actually admits that they don't know what a species even is. Boom. Game over.
You know what? I believe that was based off a question from Joshua Swamidas. So let's, you know what? I'll go back and we'll play that part too. I remember that. Doki Doki SFT fan club says, good work tonight. YEC SFT. I appreciate it. I appreciate it, brother. So let's go here. And
who created the exquisitely designed predators and adapted? Oh, understand. Yeah. Thanks. I'll take some questions. Oh, understandable.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm reminded of Ron was talking about Franklin's version theories, and he comes up with this concept of this filtration oftentimes being more evolutionists than the evolutionists.
Yeah.
So some big changes that I completely agree. I'm hoping you can help me understand, because I've really struggled to understand this in the literature. When we talk about species, maybe it's arguably a natural object, maybe even at the genus level, but typically I sometimes say, well, family level is like a human construct and not an actual thing. And when I see the creationists describe kind, but then they say it's a family level thing. When Ken Ham talks about it, it seems what he really means is it's a species that's just a little more heterozygous than other things. But when the technical literature talks about it, they seem to think of it as something that's actually not a species at all. That kind is actually this other thing with this distinct genetic capacity that species don't have. Can you help me, I guess, understand what they mean when they say it's a family level
Yeah,
thing?
I can help you a little bit. I teach a class called Systematics. We spend 4 weeks talking about what a species is. Just to figure out what a species is, in which we decide we don't really know at the end of that. But artificial construct. And yet the need to have a kind be a real thing is necessitated by the fact that since the scripture talks about kinds being brought on the ark, therefore kind has to be a real thing. So I guess you could say, taking it back to scripture, they're finding their reason for looking at a kind as being a discrete thing that we must be able to identify, right?
So what I find funny about that is we're constantly asked the question, right, Matt? And we'll start winding it down here because we're going on 4 hours, but a lot of information for people to digest. So they'll often ask, you know, or they'll harp on the fact that maybe we don't know what is exactly in the same kind in every case. But yet they admit that they don't know what a species is, which is why they have dozens of definitions for what a species may or may not be. And I would recommend, Matt, instead of us rehashing our 3-hour show a couple weeks ago on the genetic boundary study that demonstrates genetic barriers, that demonstrates separate ancestry, that demonstrates over 90% of species today arose at the same time. And the date they derive is not based on genetics or based on molecular clocks, because if it were, it'd match up perfectly with the flood bottleneck. So what do we have? Genetic boundaries demonstrated separate ancestry. Molecular clock data demonstrating independent origins. Data when it comes to DNA function, speciation rates, breeding tests. I mean, we have so many ways to demonstrate that the concept of biblical kinds is in fact a concept that is true and can be defended. But I would definitely recommend people watching that stream that we did, because we were thorough in debunking all the possible arguments put forth against that genetic boundaries study using barcoding the CO1 gene. Yeah, what are some final thoughts from you, brother? You did a great job tonight. This has been fantastic discussion, man. A lot of points. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to cover everything we possibly could. For that genetic boundary study, I recommend people go to the Creationist Clothing, and you go to scroll down to molecular clock neutral theory and validation, and you can find where the genetic boundary actually is in different species, in different kinds, and humans as well. And though this picture isn't directly in there, the predictions are all over the place on why and how you can actually define what where the boundary actually is. So that's a really important one. And before I end off, I just wanted to say that at 18 minutes and 17 seconds, he said that perdition cannot be a good thing because it is a product of sin, referring to what we believe. And I would say this is correct, and I agree with this. As I said earlier, because of one of the things, we find it in Isaiah that perdition will end again one day, and death is eradicated in the next life. But I also would say that it was never meant to be so in the beginning. And how do I know this? Because we can see the exact same thing when we look in scripture over other subjects. For example, what about slavery? And what about divorce? What happened when they asked Jesus about these things? Well, specifically in Matthew 19:18, it says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hardened. But it was not this way in the beginning. So scripture is clear that it tells us because our hearts were hardened that we did these things regardless anyway. So just like sin entered the world, it was never that way in the beginning. Sin was something new. It was introduced and it crept in and it hardened everybody's heart. It turned animal against animal, beast against beast, and man against man. And it was never meant to be. And that's why it's reverting in the next life, just the way that should be.
Amen, brother. Well said. Well said. As we always do, we challenge anybody, any skeptics, critics, to refute what we've said, to provide or put forth a stronger model. If somebody like Sentinel Apologetics or whoever thinks that they can defend universal ancestry or their model of it, version of it in a live debate, I'm happy to do so. I've had close to 100 formal debates on this topic, so it's definitely something I would not shy away from. I'm going to end it here because I think this is a good way to sum up a lot of what we said in just a couple minutes, and I think we're going to call it a night, brother, man. I know you said you had to get going, and I'm starting to lose my voice after 4 hours. So here we go. This is from another article that I've got listed in the description box. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen puts it perfectly, sums it up. Let's put all the pieces of this genetic puzzle together. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited uniparentally from only one of the two parents, the mother. Consequently, it is a very effective yet simple timekeeper for elucidating the time when species originated. And you've heard us talk over and over again. You've seen our study, Matt and I's study, that you can find on our website, Creationist Clothing, that goes over predictions. We talk about how this timekeeper found in not only the mitochondrial DNA, but the Y chromosome takes us back just a few thousand years. As copying errors have occurred over multiple generations, the mitochondrial DNA clock has ticked off the time since species first arose. This clock indicates that species originated within the last few thousand years. There's separate ancestry for you guys. Okay. I just want to read this last part here. Conversely, the fact that so many nuclear DNA differences were present from the start has tremendous implications for the plausibility of speciation on the young Earth timescale. With millions of DNA differences, pay close attention to this, guys. Speciation is not a problem for our model, okay? With millions of DNA differences, massive amounts of DNA variety, encoded into each kind from the start of their existence, the potential for speciation is mind-boggling. Combined with the fact that species can recover enormous population sizes in very short amounts of time, in addition to the fact that the vast majority of DNA sequences within a creature appear to be functional. These results demonstrate that millions of species in a few thousand years is not only plausible, it is also probable. One last thing I'd like to say too is the fact that our bottlenecks, right, Matt? The flood bottleneck was one generation followed by rapid and exponential population growth. That would actually limit the levels of heterozygosity that would have been lost. They would have retained a lot more levels of heterozygosity than the critics like to claim. And even when we are generous to the critics, we can look at common variants in humans, for example, and we see that it fits perfectly with genetic diversity since the flood bottleneck. And we touched on that in great detail in our debunking Simon and Dan video. So please check that out. Anyways, Brother Matt, any final words before we shut it down for the night?
No, I just hope that everybody liked the different perspectives, coming at it from not just a genetic viewpoint, but we looked at it from linguistics. We looked at it from a historical narrative. We tried to take every angle. We tried to be logical, every single thing we want to look at, because if we're wrong, we're wrong. We want to know. Just let's compare the arguments and see where the actual best evidence is. And it seems to me that it lines up very, very clearly with what we're telling everybody, and with what we would expect to see from the scripture. We don't make this stuff up. It's right there. It's what it's telling us, and we go, let's see if it's true, and it just happens to be. So,
amen. Thanks for being here, Joel. We appreciate it. We appreciate the interaction as well. Guys, thanks for tuning in. It's been a ton of fun, a lot of information. Share it around. This information's important. Matt and I got a lot more for you guys to look forward to. This week's going to be busy. So before we shut it down, make sure you tune in. This Wednesday, Dr. Frank Turek will be here with me. We'll be asking a lot of great questions pertaining to the Gospels, the resurrection. So make sure you are here live. Then the very next day, the big debate, Dr. Kenny Rhodes from Reasons to Believe taking on Dr. Kent Hovind from Dinosaur Adventureland. They will be debating the age of the Earth. And the very next week, Kent's going to be a busy man. Another epic age of the Earth debate, Kent versus Smokey Saint, guys. So please stay tuned. A lot to look forward to. Share around our epic destruction of science denier, Aaron Ra. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. This has been a ton of fun. God bless. Great job, Matt. And SFT and Matt Man are out.